The film begins out at sea, where a British ship cuts through thick ocean fog. A haunting child's song drifts across the deck, sung by a young Elizabeth Swann. Mr. Gibbs quickly hushes her, warning that these waters are feared for a reason. Cursed pirates are said to roam the Caribbean at night. Captain Norrington brushes the superstition aside and tells Gibbs not to fill the girl's head with nonsense. Still, he makes one thing very clear: pirates are enemies of the crown, and every last one of them will eventually face justice. Elizabeth, however, is far more fascinated than frightened by stories of pirates. While staring over the edge of the ship, she suddenly notices someone floating in the water. Panicked, she cries out that there's a boy down there. The crew immediately rushes into action and hauls the unconscious survivor aboard. It doesn't take long for Gibbs to realize the boy must have come from the remains of a wrecked ship nearby, likely destroyed in a pirate attack. As several sailors head out to inspect the burning wreckage, the boy briefly wakes in terror before collapsing again. Elizabeth quietly studies him and notices a strange gold medallion hanging around his neck, a coin marked with a skull. Instantly, she realizes the boy has some connection to pirates, but instead of exposing him, she keeps the discovery to herself. Not long afterward, Elizabeth stares at the mysterious medallion when something catches her eye in the distance. Emerging through the mist is a massive black ship with dark sails, moving like a ghost across the sea. The story then jumps forward several years. Elizabeth is now a grown woman living in Port Royal. Early one morning, she opens a hidden drawer and secretly examines the same gold medallion she took from the boy all those years ago. A knock at the door interrupts her, and she quickly hides it before servants enter and open the windows to reveal the bright Caribbean morning outside. Her father, Governor Swan, arrives carrying an elegant dress for her to wear during a special ceremony honoring Captain Norrington's promotion. While Elizabeth prepares, the governor casually points out that Norrington is a respectable man with strong feelings for her. The implication is obvious: he hopes the two might marry someday. Around the same time, a young blacksmith named Walt arrives with a finely crafted sword commissioned for Norrington. He proudly explains the details of the weapon's craftsmanship, describing its perfect balance and quality. Governor Swan compliments the work and tells Will to thank his employer. When Elizabeth comes downstairs, she warmly greets Will and mentions she dreamed about him the previous night. Will, clearly nervous around her, formally addresses her as Miss Swan. The governor seems pleased by the reminder that Will understands the social gap between them. Soon after, they all depart together for the ceremony, and then enters the most unforgettable character in the entire movie, Captain Jack Sparrow. Well, technically, he arrives aboard what's left of a ship. His tiny boat is barely staying afloat as it drifts toward Port Royal Harbor. Even before reaching shore, it's obvious this man is unlike anyone else in the Caribbean. Calmly standing atop the mast as his vessel sinks beneath him, Jack steps onto the dock at the exact moment the boat disappears underwater. A harbor official immediately stops him, demanding payment for docking and asking for his name. Jack smoothly slips him 3 extra shillings as a bribe, convincing the man to look the other way and allow him entry into Port Royal. Elsewhere in town, Norrington's promotion ceremony is in full swing. He receives his new sword while officers and civilians gather to celebrate. Meanwhile, Jack casually makes his way toward the Navy docks, where 2 guards stop him before he can approach one of the ships. The conversation quickly turns toward the Navy's prized vessel, the Interceptor. The guards proudly brag that it's the fastest ship in the Caribbean. Jack smirks and confidently replies that the Black Pearl is even faster. That immediately sparks an argument between the soldiers. One insists the Black Pearl is real, while the other dismisses it as a myth. They begin describing the ship's terrifying reputation: black sails, a cursed crew, and sightings that sound more like ghost stories than reality. Their distraction gives Jack exactly the opportunity he needs to slip past them unnoticed and board the Interceptor. The guards quickly realize he's gone and chase after him, drawing their weapons and demanding to know why he's sneaking around Navy ships. Jack answers with complete honesty, or at least his version of it. "It is my intention to commandeer one of these ships, raid, pillage, plunder, and otherwise pilfer my weaselly black guts out." Back at the ceremony, Norrington walks Elizabeth away from the crowd for a private moment. The tight corset of her dress makes it difficult for her to breathe, but Norrington mistakes her discomfort for nervousness. He begins awkwardly confessing his feelings and hinting that he hopes to marry her someday. Before Elizabeth can even respond, she suddenly faints and tumbles backward off the cliff into the ocean below. Chaos erupts instantly as everyone rushes toward the edge in horror. Without hesitation, Jack Sparrow dives into the water after her. But the moment Elizabeth falls in, the medallion around her neck releases a strange pulse, almost like a supernatural cry echoing across the sea. An unnatural wind sweeps through the harbor as if something far away has sensed it. Underwater, Jack reaches Elizabeth and drags her safely back to shore. A thick fog begins rolling in while daylight dims around them. Realizing her corset is preventing her from breathing, Jack cuts it open so she can finally gasp for air again. But during the rescue, Jack notices the gold medallion hanging from her neck. His expression changes immediately, and he asks where she got it. Before Elizabeth can answer, Norrington arrives with soldiers and draws his sword. Governor Swan orders the pirate arrested on the spot. Elizabeth protests, refusing to let the man who saved her life be executed. "Jack Sparrow, isn't it?" Norrington asks. Jack quickly corrects him. "Captain Jack Sparrow." The soldiers search through Jack's belongings and discover several unusual items, including a strange compass that doesn't point north. Norrington mocks him openly. "You are without doubt the worst pirate I've ever heard of." Jack flashes a grin. "But you have heard of me." As the guards move in to seize him, Elizabeth desperately tells them to stop. Nobody listens. Thinking fast, Jack grabs Elizabeth and takes her hostage. While holding everyone at bay, he forces her to return his weapons and belongings. Then, using ropes, beams, and rooftops around the harbor, he escapes upward and out of reach. The soldiers open fire while Jack races across Port Royal, weaving through the crowded streets as chaos spreads through town. Navy officers scramble everywhere searching for the escaped pirate. Eventually, Jack ducks into a blacksmith shop to hide, only to find the owner lying unconscious on the floor. Jack quickly studies the chains around his wrists and figures out a clever way to slip free from the cuffs. Before anyone notices, he manages to release himself and quietly moves out of sight just as Will Turner walks into the blacksmith shop. It doesn't take long for Will to realize something is off. Tools have been moved, weapons disturbed. The moment he senses another presence nearby, Jack casually steps out from hiding. Without wasting a second, both men arm themselves, and an intense sword fight erupts inside the workshop. Jack immediately realizes Will is far more skilled than he expected and begins testing the young blacksmith's technique, footwork, and reactions. The pirate attempts to flee at one point, but Will cleverly traps him by pinning the door shut with his blade, forcing the duel to continue. Steel crashes against steel as the fight spreads across the room. During the battle, Will proudly reveals that he trains with a sword for 3 hours every single day. Neither fighter gains a clear advantage, so the duel quickly becomes less about strength and more about improvisation and intelligence. They use the environment around them constantly, swinging across beams, throwing objects, and maneuvering through the crowded workshop in creative ways. Eventually, the fight spills onto the rooftops outside, where the two continue trading blows high above the streets of Port Royal. Jack finally manages to gain the upper hand by tossing dirt into Will's eyes, temporarily blinding him before pulling a pistol and aiming it directly at the blacksmith. But before Jack can escape, the Royal Navy bursts through the shop entrance downstairs. At the same moment, the unconscious blacksmith wakes up and smashes a glass bottle over Jack's head, knocking him senseless. Norrington and his men rush in immediately, and the pirate is finally captured. Norrington smugly orders his soldiers to throw Mr. Sparrow into a prison cell. Later that evening inside the jail, the imprisoned pirates are being tormented by a small dog carrying the cell keys in its mouth. The animal wanders just out of reach while the prisoners desperately try to lure it closer. Irritated by all the shouting, Jack tells everyone to shut their mouths. Meanwhile, back at the governor's mansion, Elizabeth's maid happily assumes she accepted Norrington's marriage proposal and begins congratulating her. But she also notices Elizabeth seems troubled rather than excited. Before leaving the room, the maid gently points out that Will Turner is a good man. As soon as she exits, Elizabeth's candle mysteriously burns out on its own. At nearly the same time, Will senses something strange outside. His instincts prove correct. Emerging from the darkness is the Black Pearl itself, silently gliding toward Port Royal Harbor like a phantom ship. Governor Swan and Norrington are still discussing Elizabeth when suddenly cannon fire explodes across the town. Barbossa's ship unleashes a devastating bombardment, tearing through buildings and setting the harbor ablaze. Norrington and his soldiers dive for cover as chaos erupts everywhere. The Black Pearl continues firing relentlessly while pirate crews storm into Port Royal. Flames spread through the streets, civilians panic, and the town is thrown into complete destruction. Will joins the fight immediately, battling alongside the Navy as explosions continue raining down around them. Every attempt by the soldiers to organize a defense is crushed by more cannon fire, and it quickly becomes obvious the pirates are overwhelming them. Inside the governor's mansion, armed pirates force their way toward Elizabeth's room. One of the servants is shot dead trying to stop them, while Elizabeth fiercely resists capture. She fights back long enough to break free temporarily when a nearby cannon blast distracts the attackers. Escaping into another room, she tries hiding while the pirates search the house. Unable to find her immediately, the pirates begin speaking loudly so she can hear them, mentioning the gold medallion they know she possesses. Eventually, Elizabeth realizes she has little choice left. I invoke the right of parley. The pirates immediately pause. She demands to be taken to the captain. The code requires it. We honor the code. While the attack on Port Royal continues outside, Will fights bravely through the streets until he spots Elizabeth being dragged away by the pirates. Before he can reach her, however, he's struck from behind and knocked unconscious. Back inside the prison, Jack notices the full moon beginning to rise. He attempts to lure the dog carrying the keys closer to his cell, and for a moment it almost works. But suddenly 2 pirates stumble into the jail, believing they've found the armory. The moment they recognize Captain Jack Sparrow sitting inside a cell, one pirate grabs him by the throat, and under the moonlight, Jack sees the man's arm transform into a skeletal limb. The curse is real. These pirates are undead. As clouds cover the moon again, the skeleton appearance vanishes. Meanwhile, Elizabeth is brought aboard the Black Pearl and taken before Captain Barbossa himself. One of the crewmen, Bosun, grows irritated with her attitude and strikes her across the face, but Barbossa quickly silences him. Standing before the captain and his eerie monkey companion, Elizabeth demands that Port Royal be spared from further destruction. Barbossa refuses immediately. In response, Elizabeth threatens to throw the gold medallion into the ocean. Barbossa pretends not to care, claiming the coin means nothing to him anymore. But Elizabeth sees straight through the bluff, and so does the crew. Realizing she has leverage, she lies about her identity and introduces herself as Elizabeth Turner, a servant girl. The moment the name Turner is spoken, the atmosphere changes completely. The pirates instantly recognize it. Barbossa finally agrees to stop attacking Port Royal in exchange for the medallion. Elizabeth hands it over, but then demands to be returned safely home. Barbossa calmly explains that their agreement never included that condition. Since she isn't technically a pirate, the pirate code doesn't truly protect her anyway. Or as he puts it, the code is more what you'd call guidelines. The following morning, Will regains consciousness and sees the devastation left behind after the raid. Buildings are destroyed, smoke fills the air, and dozens are dead. Desperate to rescue Elizabeth, he rushes to speak with Norrington and Governor Swan. Will insists that the only person capable of finding the Black Pearl is Jack Sparrow. Norrington absolutely hates the idea. The argument escalates quickly, and Will is eventually thrown out after refusing to back down. With no other option left, Will heads straight to the prison and confronts Jack personally. Jack explains that the Black Pearl sails from a hidden island, a place impossible to find unless someone already knows where it is. Will makes him an offer. I can get you out of here. I helped build these cells. Jack pauses after hearing his name. Will Turner, short for William, I'd wager. Named after your father, no doubt. Then Jack offers a deal of his own. Free me from this cell and I'll take you to the Black Pearl. The two immediately begin planning their escape. Their first priority is acquiring a ship, and Jack comes up with a bizarre but effective solution. Using an overturned rowboat to create an air pocket underwater, the pair sneak beneath the harbor defenses and swim undetected toward the HMS Dauntless. Once aboard, Jack proudly announces himself to the confused crew. This vessel needs more than 2 men to sail her, lad. Fortunately for you, I'm Captain Jack Sparrow. Moments later, Norrington hears shouting from the harbor. He rushes outside just in time to see the unbelievable truth with his own eyes. Jack Sparrow and Will Turner have stolen the Dauntless right out from under the Royal Navy. The moment Norrington realizes the Dauntless has been stolen, the Royal Navy scrambles into action. Soldiers rush aboard the interceptor, preparing to pursue Jack Sparrow and Will Turner before they can escape. Every available man boards the Dauntless searching for the fugitives, convinced the pair must still be somewhere on board. What none of them realize is that this confusion was exactly what Jack intended from the beginning. While the Navy floods onto the Dauntless, Sparrow quietly slips away and steals the interceptor instead, sailing straight out of the harbor with Will beside him. Norrington refuses to accept defeat and orders the cannons prepared, even if it means blowing up his own ship to stop them. But when the officers try turning the vessel into firing position, they discover Jack already sabotaged the rudder chain. The ship can't maneuver at all. Standing helplessly as the interceptor sails away into the distance, one stunned sailor can only mutter, "That has to be the greatest pirate I've ever seen." Now safely out at sea aboard the interceptor, Will finally confronts Jack about something personal. He admits he originally came to Port Royal searching for information about his father and suspects. Jack knows far more than he's saying. Jack confirms the suspicion almost immediately. He reveals that Will's father was known among pirates as Bootstrap Bill Turner, a legendary sailor and one of the finest men Jack ever sailed with. Will rejects the idea instantly. In his mind, his father could never have been a pirate, but Jack simply shrugs and gives him a harsh lesson about the reality of the world they live in. Out on the ocean, he explains, survival isn't determined by morality or laws. The only thing that matters is what a man is capable of doing and what he isn't. Eventually, the pair arrives at Tortuga, the infamous pirate haven overflowing with drunken sailors, thieves, and chaos. The place is absolute madness from the second they step ashore. People are fighting in the streets, rum bottles are flying through windows, and half the town seems ready to stab the other half. Jack barely makes it a few steps before one furious woman slaps him across the face. Moments later, another woman does exactly the same thing. Clearly, Captain Jack Sparrow has made plenty of enemies here. The first person Jack seeks out is his old companion Mr. Gibbs, who is passed out drunk. After waking him up, the two head into a crowded tavern bursting with noise and disorder. Amid the chaos, Jack reveals his plan. He's going after the Black Pearl. More specifically, he intends to take it back from Barbossa. All he needs now is a crew. Jack also hints that he already has leverage over Barbossa, gesturing toward Will Turner. He explains that Will is the son of Bootstrap Bill, and hearing that name immediately grabs Gibbs' attention. Excited by the possibility, Gibbs agrees to join the mission without hesitation. Meanwhile, aboard the Black Pearl, Elizabeth is discovering just how disturbing pirate life truly is. She's ordered to change clothes immediately, with the crew bluntly informing her that the alternative is remaining naked. Soon after, an enormous feast is laid out before her. Starving and exhausted, Elizabeth abandons all proper manners and tears into the food. Barbossa watches her with strange fascination before finally explaining the truth behind the cursed medallion. The gold coin, he says, is one piece of an ancient Aztec treasure, 882 identical coins, originally delivered to Cortés centuries ago as blood payment after the slaughter of native people by his armies. According to legend, the gods placed a terrible curse upon the treasure because of the greed and violence surrounding it. Anyone who removed even a single piece from the chest would be condemned forever. Barbossa admits that he and his crew once dismissed the story as superstition. They stole the treasure anyway and spent the gold freely, enjoying every pleasure imaginable. But eventually, they discovered the horrifying truth. Food turned to ash the moment it touched their tongues. Drink could never satisfy thirst. No amount of pleasure, wealth, or indulgence brought them fulfillment anymore. They had become cursed. While secretly hiding a knife nearby, Elizabeth learns the only way to break the curse is to return every stolen coin and repay the blood debt connected to them. Barbossa calmly thanks her for bringing the final piece they need, because her blood is meant to complete the ritual. Elizabeth reacts instantly, stabbing Barbossa directly in the chest before making a desperate run for the deck. But when she emerges outside under the moonlight, she freezes in terror. The crew surrounding her are no longer human. Under the glow of the moon, every pirate aboard transforms into a walking skeleton, twisted undead creatures trapped between life and death. Elizabeth stares in horror as the truth finally sinks in. These men cannot die. Barbossa himself steps into the moonlight and reveals his skeletal form as well. Casually holding up a bottle, he explains that despite being surrounded by food and drink for years, he can no longer taste a single drop. Then, as if nothing unusual just happened, he orders his crew back to work. The following morning, Gibbs gathers potential crew members for Jack's mission. Naturally, the recruits are about as strange as you'd expect from Tortuga. Among them is Cotton, a sailor unable to speak who communicates through his parrot instead. Then there's Anna Maria, a fierce woman disguised among the men, who immediately storms up to Jack and slaps him repeatedly for stealing her boat sometime in the past. Jack tries dodging responsibility, but Will smooths things over by offering her command of the interceptor instead. That instantly changes her mood, and she agrees to join the crew despite Gibbs grumbling that women aboard ships are bad luck. Soon, the newly assembled crew sets sail through dangerous waters and violent storms. During the journey, Jack frequently studies his mysterious compass, the same one that supposedly doesn't point north. Gibbs quietly tells Will there's more to the compass than people realize. It doesn't lead toward directions, it leads toward what a person truly wants most. At last, the ship emerges from the storm. Elsewhere aboard the Black Pearl, Elizabeth is chained up while Barbossa's crew prepares to land at Isla de Muerta, the hidden island where the cursed treasure rests. The pirates row toward a massive cave system hidden within the island. At the same time, Jack and his crew navigate through a graveyard of shipwrecks surrounding the island. Somehow, the strange compass guides them directly through the maze of destroyed vessels. During the voyage, Gibbs accidentally reveals a major secret to Will. Jack Sparrow was once the original captain of the Black Pearl. Will immediately wants answers, and Gibbs explains everything. Years ago, Jack's own crew betrayed him in a mutiny led by Barbossa. They stranded Sparrow alone on a deserted island and left him there to die while stealing the Black Pearl for themselves. Barbossa even left Jack with a single bullet in his pistol, and according to Gibbs, Jack has kept that same bullet ever since, saving it for the day he finally confronts the man who betrayed him. Before Gibbs can continue, Jack abruptly cuts the conversation short and announces it's time to head ashore. Inside the cavern at Isla de Muerta, Elizabeth stares at an enormous mountain of stolen treasure surrounding the ancient Aztec chest. The pirates spent 10 years hunting down every missing coin, and the fortune piled inside the cave is beyond imagination. Unknown to Barbossa and his crew, Jack and Will have already entered the cavern from another side entirely, silently approaching through the water while observing the treasure-filled cave from the shadows. Jack and Will move carefully through the hidden cavern, staying out of sight as they witness Barbossa and his cursed crew preparing a ritual around the massive pile of treasure. The pirates celebrate wildly, convinced that after years of suffering, they are finally moments away from breaking the curse forever. Barbossa proudly tells his men that once the final gold medallion is returned, every ounce of stolen wealth will truly belong to them again. From the shadows, Will becomes visibly tense watching Elizabeth held captive. Jack immediately notices and warns him not to do anything reckless. He tells Will to stay hidden, keep calm, and avoid ruining their advantage. Meanwhile, Elizabeth is dragged toward the ancient Aztec chest as the pirates begin chanting around her. Barbossa explains that her blood will serve as the final payment needed to lift the curse. Unable to sit still any longer, Will impulsively knocks Jack unconscious and rushes forward to intervene himself. Barbossa cuts Elizabeth's hand and lets a single drop of blood fall onto the restored treasure. For a brief moment, the crew waits in anticipation. Elizabeth even looks relieved, believing the ordeal may finally be over after such a small sacrifice, but nothing changes. The pirates stare at each other in confusion as they realize the curse remains intact. Barbossa's expression slowly shifts from disbelief to rage. He suddenly understands the truth. Elizabeth lied about her identity. She isn't connected to Bootstrap Bill Turner at all. Now furious, Barbossa demands to know where William Turner's child is, the boy who left England years earlier carrying the missing coin. Elizabeth refuses to answer, earning herself a brutal slap as the pirates pressure her for information. At the same time, tension begins growing among Barbossa's own crew. Many of the cursed pirates still resent him for betraying Bootstrap Bill and condemning him to the depths of the ocean. Some are close to outright mutiny. Before things escalate further, Barbossa notices something even worse. Both their prisoner and the medallion have vanished. Instantly, the cave erupts into chaos as the pirates begin searching everywhere. Not long after, Jack regains consciousness only to find himself surrounded by cursed pirates pointing weapons directly at him. Back aboard the Interceptor, Elizabeth finally arrives safely with the crew. Everyone immediately realizes Jack never made it back. Gibbs reluctantly reminds them of the pirate code: any man left behind stays behind. With no other choice, the crew prepares to sail away. Inside the cave, Barbossa finally comes face to face with Jack Sparrow again. Completely baffled, he asks the same question everyone always asks. How exactly did Jack escape that deserted island years ago? Jack, of course, answers in the most Jack Sparrow way possible. I'm Captain Jack Sparrow. Realizing Elizabeth's blood failed, Jack casually claims he knows whose blood the curse truly requires. Meanwhile, Elizabeth and Will finally have a quiet moment together aboard the Interceptor. Elizabeth reveals the gold medallion she secretly took from him when they were children. The moment Will sees it, everything clicks into place. He realizes the pirates were never after Elizabeth at all. They needed his blood because he is Bootstrap Bill Turner's son. Before Jack and Barbossa can finish negotiating, the conversation is interrupted by the arrival of the Black Pearl itself. The cursed ship rapidly closes in on the Interceptor, and everyone aboard immediately understands the situation is dire. No ordinary vessel can outrun the Pearl. Jack is locked inside a cell during the pursuit, but through a small opening, he watches the crew desperately tossing unnecessary cargo overboard to lighten the ship. Cannons soon begin roaring across the ocean as the Black Pearl opens fire. Will refuses to surrender without a fight. While the Interceptor races through the sea, he organizes the crew to load cannons and prepare defenses. Gibbs comes up with a risky maneuver involving the anchor, allowing the ship to swing sharply into position for a direct broadside attack. Soon both ships are facing one another head-on, blasting cannon fire across the water in a violent exchange. Explosions tear through wood and sails, while Jack screams in frustration from below deck, horrified that both the Black Pearl and the Interceptor, his ships, are being ripped apart at the same time. Eventually, the smoke and chaos create the perfect distraction for Jack to escape his cell. But despite the crew's efforts, the cursed pirates are already preparing to board. Grappling lines are hurled between the ships as skeletal pirates storm onto the Interceptor. Will becomes trapped below deck while fierce combat erupts overhead. At the same time, Jack swings wildly across ropes trying to reclaim control of the situation. During the battle, Will discovers Barbossa's monkey has stolen the medallion. Elizabeth risks herself to help him while Jack goes after the coin personally. The fight quickly turns disastrous. Elizabeth is captured again, and Barbossa successfully recovers the final piece of Aztec gold. The cursed crew erupts in celebration, believing victory is finally theirs. To make matters worse, the pirates sabotage the Interceptor and prepare it to explode, all while Will remains trapped inside the doomed ship. Barbossa then orders Elizabeth thrown overboard to his crew, when suddenly Will emerges from hiding and points a gun at himself. The dramatic move instantly grabs Barbossa's attention. The captain demands to know who he is. "My name is Will Turner. My father was Bootstrap Bill Turner." The revelation changes everything. Will negotiates directly with Barbossa, demanding Elizabeth be released and insisting the crew aboard the Interceptor must not be harmed. Barbossa technically agrees, though in the most literal way possible. Before tossing Elizabeth into the ocean, he has his men reclaim the expensive dress she's wearing first. As the crew laughs, Elizabeth is dumped into the sea. Moments later, Jack suffers the same fate. The Black Pearl sails away, leaving both of them stranded on the exact same island, where Jack had once been abandoned years earlier. Before departing, Barbossa mockingly honors tradition by giving Jack a single pistol and one bullet. Now trapped alone together, Elizabeth demands to know how Jack escaped the island the first time. Jack casually explains that smugglers once used the island to store rum, and he simply bartered passage away with them. Unfortunately, that means the island is now surrounded by endless supplies of alcohol and almost nothing else. Jack immediately begins drinking while ranting passionately about freedom, the sea, and his beloved Black Pearl. The next morning, Elizabeth decides to burn the rum supply to create a massive smoke signal visible across the ocean. Jack completely loses his mind watching years' worth of precious rum go up in flames, furious at what he considers an unforgivable crime. But Elizabeth's plan works. As Jack storms off in frustration, he suddenly spots ships approaching in the distance, the Royal Navy. Norrington and his men rescue both survivors from the island. Elizabeth immediately begs them to go after Will and rescue him from the pirates. Norrington initially refuses, insisting the Navy will not risk itself chasing pirates into unknown waters. Desperate, Elizabeth makes a shocking promise. If Norrington agrees to the mission, she will marry him. That finally changes his mind. With Jack Sparrow now guiding them toward Isla de Muerta, the Royal Navy prepares for battle. Meanwhile, aboard the Black Pearl, Will and Jack's captured crew are locked inside cages. During their imprisonment, the cursed pirates reveal the rest of Bootstrap Bill's story. Unlike the others, Bootstrap never approved of Barbossa's mutiny against Jack Sparrow. In secret, he sent one of the cursed medallions away to his son, the very coin that eventually ended up with Will Turner. The cursed crew eventually reveals the full fate of Bootstrap Bill Turner. After refusing to support Barbossa's mutiny against Jack Sparrow, Bootstrap secretly sent one of the Aztec coins to his son. Barbossa considered it an act of betrayal. As punishment, he tied Bootstrap to a cannon and sent him sinking into the deepest part of the ocean, straight to the bottom of Davy Jones' locker. While Will processes the horrifying truth about his father, the Dauntless finally arrives near Isla de Muerta. Norrington and the Royal Navy locate the hidden cavern, and Jack immediately begins working his usual manipulative magic. Quietly whispering in Norrington's ear, he convinces the Commodore to let him approach Barbossa alone in a rowboat under the guise of negotiation. As the cursed pirates emerge from the cave, they suddenly stop dead in their tracks after spotting Jack Sparrow standing there waiting for them. The crew can hardly believe it. Somehow, this man has escaped a deserted island not once, but twice. Jack calmly warns Barbossa that the Dauntless is anchored offshore and heavily armed. If Barbossa restores the curse and becomes mortal again too soon, the Navy will kill him immediately. Then Jack begins planting a far more tempting idea in Barbossa's head. Why not take the Dauntless for himself? Jack paints the picture perfectly. Barbossa steals the Royal Navy flagship, becomes Commodore Barbossa, and commands the Caribbean's most powerful ship. In exchange, Jack asks only for the Black Pearl and promises loyalty to Barbossa afterward. Naturally, Barbossa loves the idea. But as always, Jack has another angle nobody notices. During the conversation, he secretly pockets one of the cursed coins for himself. The deal is made, and Barbossa orders his crew forward. Under the moonlight, the undead pirates exploit their greatest advantage. They simply walk along the ocean floor beneath the water since drowning means nothing to them. Realizing the Navy is likely preparing an ambush, the pirates create one of their own instead. Two cursed crewmen intentionally draw attention as bait while the rest silently climb the Dauntless from beneath, scaling anchor chains and the hull itself. At the same time, Elizabeth secretly escapes the Dauntless because she's determined to save Will herself. One by one, Royal Navy soldiers begin disappearing in the darkness as the cursed pirates silently attack aboard the ship. Eventually, the crew realizes what's happening, and total chaos erupts into another massive battle. Governor Swan quickly hides for safety, while swords clash all across the deck. Meanwhile, Barbossa explains exactly how Jack Sparrow operates. Jack's the sort you can never predict. I'm dishonest, and you can always trust a dishonest man to be dishonest. Elsewhere, Will arms himself and joins the fight despite being badly outnumbered. Even with impossible odds against them, both he and Jack refuse to back down. Over on the Black Pearl, Elizabeth secretly sneaks aboard and immediately throws Barbossa's troublesome monkey overboard the moment she gets the chance. Soon after, two pirates discover her hiding on the ship, but Elizabeth cleverly tricks them and eventually finds Jack's captured crew aboard the Dauntless. The battle only grows more intense. Norrington finally understands the pirates' real strategy, but by then the Navy is already being blasted with its own cannons. The undead crew eventually discovers Governor Swan hiding nearby, putting him directly in danger. At the same time, Jack and Barbossa finally clash face-to-face in a brutal sword fight. Jack suddenly drives his blade through Barbossa's chest, only for Barbossa to stab him right back seconds later. But instead of collapsing, Jack calmly reveals the stolen cursed coin and steps into the moonlight. He's temporarily become cursed himself, making him impossible to kill. For the first time, the duel between the two pirates is truly even. While Jack keeps Barbossa occupied, Will realizes he must end the curse himself if they're going to survive. Elizabeth wants to rush in and help him, but Jack's crew refuses to abandon their posts because it would violate the pirate code. Frustrated, Elizabeth reminds them that the code is really more like guidelines anyway. When nobody moves, she grabs a rowboat and heads into the fight alone. Back aboard the Dauntless, the Royal Navy continues desperately battling for survival as pirates and soldiers tear through the ship in every direction. Eventually, Elizabeth reaches Will, and together they fight side by side against the cursed crew, while Jack continues dueling Barbossa nearby. Finally seeing his chance, Jack cuts his own hand and tosses the blood-covered medallion toward Will. Then comes the moment Jack Sparrow has waited 10 years for. He fires the single bullet he's been saving all this time directly into Barbossa. At first, Barbossa laughs, mocking Jack for wasting the shot. But then he notices something impossible, blood slowly spreading across his chest. The curse is broken. For the first time in years, Barbossa can actually feel pain again. A strange smile spreads across his face as he realizes it. Seconds later, he collapses dead onto the treasure pile. Across the Dauntless, every cursed pirate suddenly transforms back into an ordinary mortal. Instantly outmatched and no longer immortal, the surviving crew surrenders to the Royal Navy. The battle is over. Governor Swan emerges safely, and the Navy celebrates its victory. Inside the cavern, Will approaches Elizabeth while Jack casually rummages around searching for treasure, even after everything that just happened. The three eventually leave the cave together, only for Jack to discover one painful truth waiting outside: the Black Pearl is gone again. Some time later, back in Port Royal, Jack Sparrow stands at the gallows awaiting execution. Elizabeth watches helplessly as officials read aloud the long list of crimes committed by the infamous pirate captain. Though she hates seeing it happen, she admits the law is still the law. Just before the execution can begin, Will Turner suddenly steps forward, confesses his love to Elizabeth in front of everyone, and charges toward the platform. He reaches Jack mere seconds before the hanging, disrupting the execution and fighting off the guards while Jack cuts himself loose. Together, the two battle their way through wave after wave of Royal Navy soldiers across the town square. Eventually, though, they are cornered and surrounded from all sides. Norrington and Governor Swan are deeply disappointed in Will for throwing his future away over a pirate. But Will refuses to back down, insisting that Jack Sparrow is actually a good man and declaring he's willing to die beside him if necessary. Norrington raises his sword toward Will, and then something unexpected happens. Elizabeth walks over and stands beside Will publicly, choosing his side. The gesture instantly changes everything. Norrington lowers his weapon, heartbroken but understanding the truth. Jack, in his own strange way, sincerely thanks Norrington and Governor Swan for showing mercy. He also gives a quick farewell to both Will and Elizabeth before suddenly falling backward off the fort wall into the ocean below. As everyone rushes to the edge, Jack surfaces in the water and looks out toward the horizon with relief. Sailing toward the harbor is the Black Pearl herself. For the first time, both Norrington and Governor Swan decide to let Sparrow go, granting him a full day's head start before pursuit begins. Norrington also chooses to spare Will out of respect for his courage and loyalty. At long last, Jack returns aboard the Black Pearl and once again takes his rightful place as captain of the ship he loves most. Surrounded by his crew, he proudly begins barking out orders like he never left. Then Jack pulls out his mysterious compass one final time, watches the needle shift toward its destination, and steers the Black Pearl toward the horizon as the adventure comes to an end. There are certain films that succeed, and then there are films that completely absorb an entire cultural moment. Pirates of the Caribbean, The Curse of the Black Pearl was unquestionably one of those films. And looking back on it now, it still feels slightly unbelievable that it worked as well as it did, because on paper, this should have collapsed instantly. A pirate film, inspired by a Disney theme park attraction, released in the early 2000s, during a period when pirate cinema was widely considered commercially finished. Studios had already attempted to revive the genre several times before, and the results were rarely encouraging. Audiences either ignored the films entirely, or the productions became enormous financial undertakings, remembered more for their budgets than for the stories themselves. And somehow Disney looked at that history and decided to invest heavily in cursed skeletal pirates sailing through moonlit oceans. Even now, that decision feels strangely bold. But what becomes even more surprising revisiting the film today is the confidence running through it. Not confidence in the polished, overly calculated modern blockbuster sense. More like a restless, unpredictable confidence where the movie commits completely to its own personality. It never feels self-conscious about being dramatic, theatrical, strange, or excessive. And that matters because this could very easily have turned into something cynical, especially with the Disney branding attached to it. You would expect a safer version of this story, something overly refined, something carefully sanitized. Instead, The Curse of the Black Pearl is filled with texture and character. Smoke drifting through candlelit rooms, weathered ships cutting through dark water, curses, tavern chaos, exhausted pirates arguing over treasure, while Johnny Depp wanders through scenes with the energy of someone operating halfway between brilliance and complete improvisation. The film feels lived in, it feels unpredictable. Most importantly, it feels alive. I also think people sometimes forget how unusual this movie felt when it first arrived. Modern audiences are accustomed to sprawling cinematic universes and eccentric blockbuster protagonists now, but in 2003, this landed very differently. Even the tone felt unconventional. It begins as an adventure film, shifts naturally into comedy, then suddenly leans into gothic supernatural imagery with skeletal pirates walking across the ocean floor beneath the moonlight, and somehow none of it feels incompatible. Most productions attempting that tonal balance would collapse under the weight of their own ambition. This one somehow survives through sheer momentum and commitment. And honestly, a huge reason people still talk about this film today is because it did not simply become successful, it became memorable. There is a difference. Plenty of large-scale blockbusters generate enormous revenue and quietly disappear from public conversation a few years later. Pirates embedded itself into popular culture. The score, the ships, the dialogue. Jack Sparrow arriving for the first time aboard a slowly sinking boat. Even people who have not revisited the film in years can still recall specific moments almost instantly. That kind of lasting imagery is rare. Part of the film's legacy also comes down to timing. It arrived before every blockbuster began feeling engineered according to the same formula. There is still a genuine unpredictability running through the movie. Certain scenes linger longer than expected. Some jokes land in awkward, oddly charming ways. The pacing occasionally becomes chaotic. A few plot mechanics start falling apart the moment you examine them too closely. But strangely enough, those imperfections help the film rather than damage it. It feels handcrafted instead of algorithmically assembled. Even revisiting it now, you can sense the production discovering its identity as it unfolds. Almost as if nobody involved fully realized they were creating one of the defining adventure films of that era while they were making it. There is a looseness to the energy that later franchise installments, and many modern blockbusters in general, often lose once they become too aware of their own cultural importance. And maybe that is why the first Pirates of the Caribbean still resonates differently compared to so many contemporary studio spectacles. It is not desperately trying to manufacture iconic moments every few minutes. It simply became iconic naturally. What makes the story surrounding the Curse of the Black Pearl even more interesting is that younger audiences may not fully understand how unlikely this film actually was. Pirate movies were not considered fashionable before this release. In fact, they were largely viewed as commercially unreliable. Hollywood had already attempted multiple revivals of the genre, and most of those productions either underperformed financially or vanished from public memory almost immediately. And when those failures happened, they happened on a massive scale. Cutthroat Island became one of those legendary industry cautionary tales that still gets referenced whenever expensive studio productions fail to meet expectations. Even highly respected filmmakers struggled to make pirate cinema connect with modern audiences. So by the early 2000s, the phrase big-budget pirate movie carried a certain skepticism with it. And honestly, that skepticism made sense. Pirate stories are deceptively difficult to execute well. They can become unintentionally theatrical very quickly. Either they lean too heavily into seriousness and lose all sense of adventure, or they overcommit to exaggerated camp and start feeling artificial. Finding the right balance is much harder than it appears. That is where the Curse of the Black Pearl surprised people. It understood something essential. Pirate stories are supposed to feel adventurous first, not relentlessly grim. Not obsessed with historical realism, not emotionally exhausting. Audiences want danger, curses, treasure hunts, betrayals, sea battles, myths, eccentric personalities, stories that feel like legends being retold in a crowded harbor tavern somewhere near midnight. And this film understands that instinct perfectly. What makes it even more fascinating is that Disney easily could have approached this cautiously. That is part of what makes revisiting the movie so interesting now. The studio could have transformed it into a completely harmless family adventure where every edge felt softened. Instead, the film includes skeletal pirates drinking wine through exposed ribs, cursed sailors walking silently beneath the ocean's surface, characters being burned, stabbed, and condemned by supernatural forces. Not in a way that pushes fully into horror, but enough to give the world genuine atmosphere and weight. The darker texture prevents the movie from feeling artificial. The timing helped too. This was released before every major franchise became consumed with interconnected mythology and endless lore building. Pirates feels spontaneous compared to many modern franchise films. Its primary goal is simply to entertain the audience for 2 hours with as much momentum, spectacle, and chaos as possible. At times, the story barely pauses long enough for you to question anything, which honestly feels perfectly appropriate for a pirate adventure. You can also feel how deeply the movie draws inspiration from older adventure cinema without becoming trapped by nostalgia. Certain sequences evoke classic swashbucklers, serialized pirate tales, and fantasy adventures from decades earlier, yet the film never feels outdated or overly reverent toward the past. It modernized the genre without stripping away the sense of fun that made those stories appealing in the first place, and that was the key difference. Many unsuccessful pirate films before this attempted to revive the genre in a self-important way. The Curse of the Black Pearl simply focused on making pirate adventures entertaining again. That was all audiences really needed, and once viewers connected with it, the cultural shift happened almost immediately. Pirate imagery suddenly returned everywhere. Video games, costumes, merchandise, theme parks, sequels, imitators, the broader cultural identity surrounding pirates changed because of this film. And of course, Jack Sparrow became the defining face of that movement. But honestly, even beyond Jack Sparrow, the film deserves recognition for understanding what audiences truly wanted from this type of story: escapism. Larger-than-life personalities, sword fights, ghost stories, treasure hunts, eventually sea monsters, pure adventure film energy delivered with complete sincerity. The movie never behaves as though being a pirate film is something embarrassing that needs ironic distance. That sounds simple, but it mattered enormously. And one of the funniest things about revisiting The Curse of the Black Pearl now is explaining to younger audiences what this project actually looked like before release. Because today, when people hear Pirates of the Caribbean, they immediately think of a massive franchise, billion-dollar box office numbers, Johnny Depp, instantly recognizable music, and one of Disney's defining modern brands. But at the time, this was simply a film adaptation of a Disney theme park ride. That was the entire pitch, and not even one of those attractions built around some elaborate narrative mythology. The original ride was essentially boats drifting through pirate towns, cannon fire echoing in the background, skeletal remains hidden in caves, animatronic pirates singing about rum and theft, and somehow Disney looked at all of that and saw the foundation for a major cinematic release. Honestly, if this film had failed, people would probably still reference it today as an example of Hollywood completely misreading what audiences wanted. Because when you really examine the circumstances, the level of risk involved here was extraordinary. A massive production budget, a pirate genre that already carried a reputation for commercial disappointment, a supernatural storyline centered around cursed treasure and undead sailors. And at the center of it all, Johnny Depp delivering a lead performance with the energy of a sleep-deprived rock musician drifting unpredictably through every scene. On top of that, Disney allowed the film to embrace a darker atmosphere than many audiences expected from the studio at that time. Any one of those elements could have pushed the project off balance. Combined together, it should have been chaotic, and strangely enough, you can still feel that uncertainty while watching the movie now. In a way, that uncertainty becomes part of its appeal. The film never carries the overly engineered feeling that later franchise installments sometimes develop. Instead, it feels like a group of talented filmmakers trying to create something genuinely entertaining without fully knowing whether audiences would embrace it or reject it entirely. There is something refreshing about that creative risk now. You can also tell the filmmakers understood that adapting the attraction too literally would have been a mistake. Rather than forcing complicated mythology directly out of the ride itself, they borrowed fragments of imagery and atmosphere from it instead. The pirate town, the prison sequence, the dog holding the keys outside the jail cell, skeletons hidden inside caves, small visual details that longtime fans of the attraction could recognize immediately without the entire film depending on nostalgia to function. That was an intelligent decision, because the movie works perfectly well even for viewers who have never visited a Disney park. And honestly, I think that is one reason the film connected so strongly with audiences. It does not feel like corporate branding disguised as storytelling. Oddly enough, it feels closer to a classic adventure film that simply happens to share some creative DNA with a theme park attraction. Even the tone feels more daring than people sometimes remember. There were moments in this movie that genuinely surprised audiences at the time. The skeletal transformations beneath moonlight, the darker supernatural imagery, the chaotic island sequences fueled by alcohol and desperation, sword fights where characters genuinely feel as though they are attempting to eliminate each other rather than carefully performing clean, consequence-free choreography. Disney generally approached large-scale entertainment more cautiously during that era, so this movie immediately stood apart. It still carries that broad, crowd-pleasing Disney spirit, obviously, but there is roughness around the edges too. Smoke drifting through candlelit rooms, damp caves illuminated by moonlight, pirates behaving like dangerous outlaws rather than polished mascots. The film needed that texture. Without it, the entire experience probably becomes far more forgettable. And honestly, I do not think the people making this movie fully understood what they had yet. Rewatching it now, there is a loose, experimental energy running through large portions of the film. Almost like the creative team knew they wanted swashbuckling adventure, supernatural fantasy, and comedy operating together at the same time, but they were still discovering the exact rhythm scene by scene. That unpredictability gives the movie personality, because once the sequels arrived and the franchise transformed into a global entertainment machine, everything naturally became larger, denser, and more mythology-driven. But the first film still feels scrappier by comparison. Expensive, absolutely, but creatively scrappy, and maybe that is why audiences connected with it so intensely. It never feels like a studio attempting to imitate great adventure films. It feels like filmmakers genuinely trying to bring adventure cinema back into the mainstream. What I really appreciate about the story in Pirates of the Caribbean, The Curse of the Black Pearl, is that underneath all the spectacle and chaos, it is actually built on a very straightforward adventure framework. And I mean that as a compliment, because when people remember this movie, they usually think about the larger cultural elements first: Jack Sparrow, the soundtrack, the skeletal pirates, the endlessly quoted dialogue. But once you strip everything else away, the structure itself is surprisingly traditional. There is cursed treasure, a governor's daughter taken by pirates, a blacksmith secretly tied to pirate history, a captain attempting to reclaim his stolen ship after a mutiny. That is essentially the core story. Everything else is personality layered on top of it. And honestly, that simplicity is a major reason the film works so well. The opening immediately feels like someone telling you an old maritime legend. Fog covering the ocean, the aftermath of a shipwreck, a mysterious medallion discovered in silence, small hints about pirates long before we properly meet any of the major characters. The movie does not overwhelm the audience with exposition immediately. It teases the world first. Then once the timeline shifts forward, the momentum accelerates almost instantly. Elizabeth possesses the medallion. Will is in love with Elizabeth. Norrington intends to marry Elizabeth. Jack Sparrow arrives in Port Royal already creating disorder within minutes of appearing on screen. Then suddenly pirates attack the town. Elizabeth is taken. Jack is imprisoned. Will frees Jack. And before the audience fully settles into the story, everyone is already crossing the ocean in pursuit of the Black Pearl. The film rarely pauses for long, and honestly, there are moments where it almost feels overwhelming, especially in the latter half. Betrayals layered inside other betrayals, alliances constantly shifting. Characters negotiating deals, escaping confinement, reclaiming ships, losing ships again, secretly manipulating one another from every direction. When you really trace the full plot step by step, it becomes surprisingly chaotic. But the movie maintains enough momentum that audiences rarely stop to question it too deeply. That is something I noticed immediately revisiting it. The screenplay understands that pirate stories are supposed to feel messy in an entertaining way. Everyone is deceiving someone. Everyone has hidden motives. Nobody fully trusts anybody else. Even when Jack Sparrow appears helpful, it still feels as though he is quietly managing several additional plans somewhere in the background. So the constant instability actually strengthens the atmosphere rather than weakening it. I also think the film balances its fantasy elements with the adventure side remarkably well. Because when you really think about the curse itself, it is actually quite dark. Barbossa and his crew cannot feel pleasure anymore. They cannot enjoy food, drink, or life itself. They cannot truly die. Under moonlight, they transform into skeletal figures suspended between life and death indefinitely. That is a genuinely unsettling concept, but the movie never becomes consumed by its own mythology. The supernatural elements are introduced gradually. At first, it simply feels like a pirate adventure. Then, almost without warning, it transforms into a ghost story as well. And I really like that progression because the audience discovers the curse alongside Elizabeth. That reveal still works beautifully, by the way. The moment the pirates transform beneath the moonlight, the entire atmosphere shifts for a few minutes. Up until then, the film operates through humor, sword fights, and adventure spectacle. Then suddenly you are watching undead pirates emerging from darkness, and the movie catches you slightly off guard. Strangely enough, the film becomes even more entertaining afterward, because now the story is no longer built solely around treasure maps and naval battles. Suddenly there are supernatural consequences attached to everything. I also appreciate that the emotional core never becomes overly complicated. Beneath all the mythology, curses, and pirate politics, the story is still fundamentally about Will attempting to rescue Elizabeth and Jack attempting to reclaim the Black Pearl. Those motivations remain easy to follow even while the surrounding plot spirals into complete disorder. And honestly, the movie benefits from that clarity because there are definitely moments where it tests your ability to keep track of its internal rules. Who betrayed whom? Which gold pieces have been returned? Who remains immortal at a particular moment? Who can actually be harmed? Which secret plan was operating underneath another secret plan? There are scenes where the film genuinely feels as though it is inventing pirate logic in real time. But somehow, that also becomes part of its charm. The entire movie feels like an exaggerated sea legend being retold late at night in a crowded tavern after far too much rum and far too many impossible stories. The details become larger every time the story moves forward. The betrayals grow more dramatic. The curses become stranger. The escapes become increasingly absurd in the best possible way. That momentum carries the entire film. And honestly, I think that is why the structure still holds together so effectively despite the runtime. The movie constantly introduces a new complication, a new alliance, or another sudden reversal before the audience has time to disengage. Occasionally, maybe too quickly, if we are being honest, but I would still take that over a pirate film that drifts into lifelessness. The movie understands something essential about adventure storytelling. It should always feel in motion. In Pirates of the Caribbean, the curse of the Black Pearl moves like it has already stolen something valuable and needs to leave the harbor before sunrise. And honestly, I genuinely do not think Pirates of the Caribbean becomes a cultural phenomenon without Johnny Depp. Not even close. You can have the ships, the score, the cursed pirates, the enormous budget, all of it. But if Jack Sparrow does not work, this entire production probably becomes just another loud early 2000s blockbuster that fades from public memory a few years later. And the remarkable thing is, by every conventional standard, that performance should not have worked at all. Seriously, imagine being a Disney executive watching early footage of Depp playing this character for the first time. You hire him for your massive pirate adventure film, and suddenly he appears on screen behaving like an exhausted rock musician who accidentally wandered into the wrong production entirely. The walk feels off balance. The speech drifts unpredictably. His reactions arrive half a second later than expected. Sometimes he appears brilliant, other times he looks completely worn out, and somehow it becomes perfect for the movie. That is what still impresses me about the performance. Jack Sparrow is essentially chaos in human form, but Depp never loses control of the character. There is always intelligence hidden underneath the disorder. Even when Jack appears confused, you still get the sense that he is quietly studying everyone else in the room, or perhaps not, and that uncertainty becomes part of what makes him so entertaining. Because with most blockbuster characters, you understand them immediately. Hero, villain, comic relief, everything is clearly defined. Jack Sparrow feels elusive. You are never entirely certain whether he is about to save the situation, ruin the plan, betray someone, or accidentally survive through pure instinct and timing. Depp somehow plays all of those possibilities simultaneously. I think what truly made the character iconic, though, is the complete commitment behind the performance. Depp never hesitates. He is not trying to make Jack cool in the traditional action film sense. In fact, half the time Jack looks vaguely ridiculous. He stumbles through scenes. He gets slapped constantly. His plans collapse regularly. His introduction literally involves his boat sinking beneath him, while he calmly steps onto the dock pretending everything is under control. And yet he carries himself like the greatest pirate alive anyway. That contradiction is the genius of the character. And honestly, I had forgotten how genuinely funny he is in this film. Not in the modern blockbuster sense, where every line is aggressively written to become a joke. A lot of the humor comes from tiny behavioral details, facial expressions, pauses, the way Jack reacts to danger as though it is simultaneously catastrophic and mildly inconvenient. Even simple dialogue becomes memorable purely because of Depp's delivery. There is also this fascinating balance where Jack feels larger than life while somehow remaining believable within the world of the movie, which should be impossible because on paper the character almost sounds cartoonish. But Depp gives him enough grounded little behaviors and human instincts that you accept him as a real person inside this universe. A very strange person, obviously, but still believable. And what makes the role even more significant is how completely it transformed Depp's career. Before Pirates, he was respected as an actor, but he was still primarily associated with eccentric projects and unconventional performances. After Jack Sparrow, he became an international blockbuster icon almost overnight. This was the role that permanently embedded him into global popular culture. You can actually feel the movie realizing in real time that it has discovered something special too. Every time Jack enters a scene, the energy shifts immediately. The film becomes looser, funnier, less predictable, even when the narrative starts becoming chaotic, and honestly, it absolutely does at times. Depp keeps everything engaging purely through screen presence alone. There are moments where the movie almost feels like it is struggling to keep pace with him. And strangely enough, I think that imbalance is part of why audiences connected with the character so intensely. Jack Sparrow does not feel engineered by committee. He does not feel carefully designed through focus groups and market research. The performance is too unusual for that, too specific, too risky. Watching him feels like watching Depp invent this bizarre pirate entirely inside his own imagination, and then commit to it more confidently than anyone expected. And honestly, credit also belongs to Gore Verbinski for allowing that performance to exist in the first place, because apparently the studio was nervous about Depp's interpretation initially, which completely makes sense. If you describe Jack Sparrow out loud, he genuinely sounds like a terrible idea for the lead character in a major Disney blockbuster. But the second Depp appears on screen, the entire approach suddenly makes sense. The film needed someone unpredictable at its center. Without that strange energy, Pirates of the Caribbean probably becomes generic. With it, the movie becomes unforgettable. What makes Jack Sparrow so fascinating to watch is not simply that he is funny. Plenty of characters are funny. The difference is that with Jack, you are never entirely certain what is happening inside his mind. And I love that aspect of the character, because the movie constantly plays this fascinating game where Jack appears to be both the least intelligent person in the room and the most intelligent person in the room at exactly the same time. Sometimes within the same conversation, there are scenes where he is stumbling around, speaking in fragmented nonsense, distracted by rum, improvising plans that sound completely irrational, and then suddenly, 5 minutes later, you realize he understood the situation before everybody else did. Or maybe he did not. Maybe he simply adapted faster than everyone around him once events started collapsing. The movie never fully clarifies that, and honestly, the ambiguity makes him far more entertaining. That unpredictability is central to the character's identity. Jack does not move through scenes like a conventional protagonist. Most action heroes are designed to feel controlled and stable. Jack feels intentionally unstable. He deceives people constantly, changes alliances whenever it benefits him, escapes impossible situations through bizarre improvisation, and survives disasters that should absolutely eliminate him. Yet the character never feels random. That is important, because there is clearly a method hidden underneath the chaos. Jack understands people exceptionally well, probably better than anyone else in the film. He understands greed. He understands arrogance. He understands fear. He knows exactly how pirates think, how soldiers think, how desperate people make decisions. And more importantly, he understands how easily people underestimate someone who appears disorganized. That is why the drunken performance aspect of the character works so effectively. Everyone sees the uneven walk, the slurred delivery, the dramatic gestures, and they assume Jack is barely functioning. Meanwhile, he is quietly observing every person around him, watching reactions, testing motives, looking for exits before conversations have even ended. Honestly, some of my favorite Jack Sparrow moments are the quieter ones where the intelligence underneath the performance becomes visible for only a second. Tiny expressions where the theatrical behavior briefly disappears, and you suddenly realize this man is genuinely dangerous when he chooses to be. And the movie wisely refuses to over-explain any of this. It trusts the audience to figure Jack out gradually, instead of forcing the character into some oversized emotional monologue explaining exactly who he is. We learn about him through behavior, through manipulation, through the reactions of everyone around him, through the fact that absolutely nobody fully trusts him, including the audience. And the funniest part is that Jack probably would not want people trusting him anyway. Because beneath all the charm, he is selfish. That is something people occasionally forget because Depp makes him so likable. Jack is not secretly some noble hero pretending to be irresponsible. He is opportunistic. He manipulates Will constantly. He steals. He lies. A large portion of Jack's plans revolve around reclaiming the Black Pearl regardless of who gets caught in the fallout. But then the movie introduces these smaller, quieter moments where you realize he is not entirely without conscience either. And suddenly, the character becomes far more layered than he initially appears. I also think the unpredictability surrounding Jack changes the rhythm of the film itself. Scenes become immediately less structured whenever he enters them because he does not behave like a traditional blockbuster protagonist. Most heroes move directly toward objectives. Jack sort of drifts sideways through the narrative, creating confusion everywhere he goes. Honestly, there are moments where it almost feels like the other characters are struggling to keep pace with him. Especially during conversations where Jack begins explaining things in these strange half-riddles that somehow arrive at a coherent point eventually, more or less. And that is another reason the character became iconic. Jack Sparrow is not cool in the conventional movie star sense. He is sweaty, eccentric, slightly unstable, and permanently one step away from disaster. Half the time, his confidence feels completely disconnected from reality. But strangely enough, that makes him even more compelling, because he survives almost entirely through instinct, improvisation, manipulation, and personality rather than physical dominance or heroic perfection. He walks into situations with absolutely no visible control and somehow leaves with the advantage anyway, or at the very least, he survives them, usually. And honestly, I think that is exactly why audiences connected with him so strongly at the time. Jack felt genuinely different from most blockbuster leads of that era. He was not attempting to embody the flawless action hero archetype. He was not stoic. He was not overly polished. He felt messy, human, completely unpredictable, like someone who accidentally wandered into a legendary pirate tale and somehow became the legend anyway. As remarkable as Johnny Depp is in this movie, and yes, he absolutely dominates it, I honestly think Pirates of the Caribbean. The Curse of the Black Pearl falls apart without Jeffrey Rush balancing the energy on the opposite side. Because imagine for a second if Barbossa had been uninteresting. Seriously. If the villain were simply another generic pirate captain shouting orders for 2 hours, Jack Sparrow's eccentricity probably becomes exhausting eventually. The movie needed someone capable of matching Depp's energy without attempting to imitate it. And Jeffrey Rush understood that balance perfectly. What I love about Barbossa is that he feels like the classic pirate myth fully brought to life. If Jack Sparrow represents chaos, improvisation, and instability, Barbossa represents old maritime legend. The voice, the posture, the elaborate speeches, the enormous hat, the grin that constantly feels half theatrical performance and half genuine menace. He resembles the kind of pirate character a child imagines after hearing ghost stories about cursed ships and lost treasure. But Rush adds just enough humor and personality to prevent Barbossa from becoming cartoonishly evil. That is the balance he captures so effectively. The character feels threatening, but also strangely entertaining to listen to. Half the time, it sounds as though Barbossa is performing for his own crew simply because he enjoys being Captain Barbossa that much. And honestly, it works beautifully. The film understands that pirate stories should feel slightly oversized, and Geoffrey Rush has one of those faces capable of transforming a scene through the smallest expression alone. There are moments where Barbossa barely needs dialogue at all. Just watching him react to Jack Sparrow's endless nonsense is enough to make scenes entertaining. You can feel the exhaustion and irritation underneath his reactions, as though Barbossa has spent years dealing with this man and still cannot fully process the fact that Jack Sparrow exists. And strangely enough, that history between them gives the movie texture. It feels like these two characters were already irritating each other long before the audience arrived. The film wisely avoids over-explaining their relationship too much. You gradually piece it together through conversations, betrayals, insults, and shifting alliances. There is mutual understanding between them mixed with absolute distrust. Honestly, some of the best scenes in the movie are simply Jack and Barbossa talking to each other, not even fighting, just verbally maneuvering around one another while both pretend they still control the situation. And I think Barbossa works especially well because beneath all the theatrical pirate behavior, there is genuine misery inside the character too. The curse truly destroyed him. That detail gives Barbossa far more depth than the average adventure film antagonist. He is no longer chasing treasure out of greed alone. At this point, he simply wants to feel alive again. Food tastes like ash. Rum no longer affects him. Nothing brings satisfaction anymore. Imagine existing for years unable to truly experience pleasure, comfort, or relief from anything around you. That is honestly a deeply unsettling idea. And Rush plays that exhaustion remarkably well underneath the humor. There are moments where Barbossa suddenly feels weary instead of evil. Like immortality itself has become an unbearable burden he desperately wants to escape from, which instantly makes him more compelling than a standard villain with a sword. I also think the movie benefits enormously from the fact that Barbossa genuinely feels competent. He is dangerous, intelligent, manipulative. He maintains authority over his crew, understands the curse better than anyone else, and spends most of the story operating one step ahead of the other characters. That matters because Jack Sparrow requires an opponent worthy of him. If Barbossa were weak, Jack's victories would feel far less satisfying, and visually, Geoffrey Rush simply looks extraordinary in this role. The costume design, the moonlit skeletal transformations, the close-up shots during his speeches, the film clearly understands that he possesses the perfect face for pirate cinema. Gore Verbinski uses that constantly. There are scenes where Barbossa is framed less like a traditional blockbuster antagonist and more like a gothic horror figure emerging from maritime folklore, especially during the curse reveal sequences. And honestly, I had forgotten how funny Barbossa is too, not broad comedy, dry, controlled humor. There is a constant layer of irritation and sarcasm running through Rush's performance that keeps him entertaining even during exposition-heavy scenes. He never portrays Barbossa as a screaming monster. The character is far too composed for that. Well, mostly composed. And that contrast with Jack Sparrow is exactly what makes their dynamic so effective. Jack feels loose, improvisational, impossible to predict. Barbossa feels measured, theatrical, and calculated. One character thrives through chaos while the other desperately tries to maintain control over it. The movie genuinely needs both energies, because without Barbossa grounding the narrative slightly, Jack Sparrow could easily push the film completely off balance. And without Jack, Barbossa risks becoming too conventional. Together, though, that is where the real magic happens. One thing I noticed revisiting Pirates of the Caribbean, The Curse of the Black Pearl, is that people understandably focus most of their attention on Jack Sparrow. But honestly, the movie would not function emotionally without Will Turner and Elizabeth Swann anchoring the story underneath all the pirate chaos. Because someone has to keep the narrative grounded, while Jack is out there navigating situations like an exhausted raccoon carrying a compass. And I actually think Orlando Bloom and Kara Knightley deliver stronger performances in this first film than they usually receive credit for. Now, are their characters the most immediately entertaining people in the movie? No. Definitely not. The moment Jack Sparrow or Barbossa enters a scene, your attention naturally shifts toward them because those characters are intentionally written larger and performed with more theatrical energy. But that contrast is deliberate. Will and Elizabeth are supposed to feel emotionally steadier compared to the pirate madness surrounding them, especially Will. Will Turner is essentially the straight line running through a story filled with crooked people. He is sincere, loyal, romantic, talented, and honestly a little naive at times. But the film absolutely needs that presence. If every character spent the entire film joking, deceiving people, and shifting alliances every few minutes, the experience would eventually become exhausting. Will gives the audience someone emotionally clear to follow through all the chaos, and Orlando Bloom plays him with enough sincerity that it genuinely works. He never tries to compete with Johnny Depp's eccentric performance either, which was probably the smartest decision possible. Imagine if Will Turner had also been written as quirky and exaggerated. The movie would have completely lost its balance. Instead, Bloom approaches the character very directly. He loves Elizabeth. He wants to rescue her. He believes in loyalty and honor, even while surrounded by pirates who absolutely do not. That simplicity strengthens the film far more than people sometimes realize. And honestly, I like the fact that Will gradually gets pulled deeper into pirate life against his own instincts. There is this constant tension running through the character, where he wants to remain connected to law, structure, and morality, but his journey keeps dragging him toward outlaw culture and uncertainty anyway. Then there is Elizabeth, and I honestly think Keira Knightley quietly carries a huge amount of the movie on her shoulders, because the character very easily could have become nothing more than the governor's daughter who gets kidnapped. And technically, yes, that is part of the plot. But Elizabeth has significantly more personality than the typical early 2000s blockbuster love interest. She is stubborn, curious, impulsive, and occasionally reckless in ways that genuinely affect the story. And I appreciate that the film allows her to actively participate in situations instead of simply waiting to be rescued. She negotiates with Barbossa. She manipulates people when necessary. She deceives pirates to survive. Even smaller details, like her fascination with pirate culture despite growing up surrounded by rigid British authority, give the character additional texture. You can sense that Elizabeth is deeply bored by the life already planned for her. And that matters because it explains why she feels drawn toward Will, and eventually toward the pirate world itself. There is this subtle underlying feeling that she wants adventure long before the story officially gives her one. And honestly, the chemistry between Bloom and Knightley works best during the quieter moments. Not necessarily in the middle of giant action sequences, but during smaller conversations where you can feel the class divide sitting quietly underneath everything. Will is a blacksmith. Elizabeth is expected to marry someone respectable like Norrington. The film never overwhelms the audience with that tension, but it is always present in the background shaping their relationship. I also appreciate that their romance in this first film remains relatively sincere and uncomplicated. Before the sequels expanded everything into increasingly dense mythology and relationship drama, this movie keeps the emotional core remarkably clean. Will loves Elizabeth. Elizabeth loves Will. Pirates, curses, and undead sailors are making that difficult. That is essentially the entire emotional framework. And honestly, that simplicity works perfectly for this kind of adventure story. Because the romance is not trying to overpower the pirate adventure. It exists to give the audience something human to hold on to, while the film launches sword fights, sea battles, curses, and supernatural chaos at them for over 2 hours. I also think Will and Elizabeth help emphasize what makes Jack Sparrow feel so unusual. When those two characters share scenes together, the movie feels more traditional. Romance, sincerity, emotional tension, personal stakes. Then Jack suddenly enters the frame, and the energy immediately becomes unstable again. That contrast is incredibly important to the rhythm of the film, and while it is true that Will and Elizabeth occasionally get overshadowed by Depp and Geoffrey Rush, honestly, almost anyone would, I still think the movie collapses emotionally without them. Somebody has to sincerely care about what is happening. Somebody has to react like a real human being when cursed skeletal pirates start walking through moonlight. Otherwise, the audience eventually stops caring too. So yes, Jack Sparrow may have become the defining face of the franchise, but Will and Elizabeth are a huge reason the first film still feels emotionally complete, instead of becoming 2.5 hours of pirate chaos with nothing underneath it. One of the most difficult things adventure movies have to manage successfully is tone. Seriously, especially when the story involves pirates, curses, undead skeletons, romance, sword fights, British naval officers, supernatural mythology, and comedy all operating at the same time. That combination can collapse very quickly if the balance is wrong. But Pirates of the Caribbean, The Curse of the Black Pearl somehow figures that balance out almost immediately. The movie understands something essential. Pirate stories are supposed to be entertaining, not in the sense of constant punchlines or self-aware parody, just playful. There is this mischievous energy running through nearly every scene. Even during serious moments, it feels like the film has a quiet grin somewhere beneath the surface. And honestly, I think the dialogue carries a massive part of that tone. Because if you actually pay attention to the way characters speak in this movie, almost everyone sounds like they are genuinely enjoying the world they exist in. The writers clearly understood that pirate dialogue should feel theatrical without becoming exhausting. So you get dramatic pirate speeches, exaggerated threats, strange maritime expressions, and elaborate storytelling rhythms, but everything is delivered with enough charm that it becomes memorable instead of embarrassing. Half of Jack Sparrow's dialogue should not even function on paper. A lot of what he says is complete nonsense, or partial nonsense, or sentences that sound profound until you think about them for 2 extra seconds. But Depp's delivery makes all of it entertaining anyway, and sometimes the humor is not even in the line itself. It is in the pause beforehand, or the expression afterward, or the way Jack reacts to surviving another conversation, like he deserves credit simply for making it through. The movie also wisely distributes the humor across the entire cast, instead of relying entirely on Jack. Barbossa has this dry, irritated sarcasm that makes him entertaining even while explaining the mechanics of the curse. The pirate crew members constantly argue with each other, like exhausted coworkers trapped on an immortal ship together. Norrington's seriousness becomes unintentionally funny because everyone surrounding him behaves like complete chaos. Even background moments carry personality. And what really stood out to me revisiting the movie is how natural most of the comedy feels. Modern blockbusters sometimes interrupt scenes entirely just to make sure the audience notices a joke happened. Pirates usually avoids that. The humor tends to emerge naturally from the characters colliding with one another. A lot of it feels slightly messy in the best possible way, almost like the actors are simply enjoying the rhythm of the scenes together. And honestly, the movie gets away with an enormous amount because of that playful tone. If this exact screenplay were performed with complete seriousness, large portions of it would sound ridiculous. You have cursed Aztec gold, immortal skeletal pirates, elaborate speeches about pirate codes, prison escapes happening every 20 minutes. When you actually list everything out loud, the story becomes completely absurd. But because the film approaches all of it with this energetic, swashbuckling spirit, the audience happily goes along with it. That balance between sincerity and comedy is incredibly important too. The movie constantly jokes around, but it never fully transforms into satire. It still wants the audience emotionally invested in the adventure. The danger still matters. The curse still feels unsettling. Characters can still die. Which actually makes the humor land even better because the stakes underneath everything remain real. I also love how much texture comes through in the pirate language itself. The insults, the dramatic phrasing, the storytelling rhythm, it all gives the world personality. Characters in this movie do not speak like modern action heroes. Everyone sounds slightly heightened and theatrical, and that becomes part of the charm. Even relatively small lines became iconic purely because of the delivery and rhythm attached to them. And strangely enough, some of the funniest scenes are not even structured as overt comedy scenes. They become funny simply because Jack Sparrow exists inside them. Watching him improvise his way through conversations is half the entertainment of the film. There are moments where it genuinely feels like the other characters are exhausted trying to understand what this man is actually talking about. Honestly, Barbossa's reactions to Jack Sparrow alone deserve credit for a significant portion of the film's humor. And I think that playful energy is also what makes the movie so endlessly rewatchable. The film is long, genuinely long at times, but because the atmosphere remains so agile and energetic, it rarely feels weighed down by its own runtime or importance. Even exposition-heavy scenes usually contain some small piece of character interaction, sarcasm, or visual detail keeping the momentum alive. The movie always feels like it is enjoying itself, and that is the key distinction. It is not mocking pirate movies. It genuinely loves being one. That enthusiasm eventually becomes contagious for the audience too. I think one reason the action in Pirates of the Caribbean, The Curse of the Black Pearl still holds up so well is because it actually feels playful. And I mean that as a genuine compliment. A lot of modern blockbuster action eventually starts blending together. Massive digital destruction, unstable camera work, characters colliding in gray environments until the entire sequence becomes visual noise. But the action in Pirates has personality. You can usually tell who is fighting, where they are, what the objective is, and most importantly, the movie wants the action to feel entertaining rather than simply overwhelming. That difference matters enormously. Take the sword fights, for example. Many of them are choreographed almost like dance sequences. especially the blacksmith duel between Will Turner and Jack Sparrow early in the film. That scene communicates so much about both characters without requiring exposition. Will fights with discipline, precision, and control. Jack fights like someone inventing strategies in real time while refusing to acknowledge the possibility of failure. And I love how much the environment becomes part of the choreography too. They leap across beams, crash through equipment, grab random objects, improvise constantly. The fight has movement and personality. It never feels like two actors mechanically clashing swords until the scene ends. Honestly, that sequence alone establishes the tone for the entire film's approach to action. Everything feels adventurous first. Even the larger naval battles carry this old-fashioned swashbuckling energy. Cannon fire tearing through wooden ships, pirates swinging across ropes, crews shouting through complete chaos. The sequences feel messy in a fun, cinematic way rather than overly polished, which honestly feels exactly right for pirate combat, and I really appreciate that the ships themselves feel important. The Black Pearl, the Interceptor, the Dauntless, they do not simply function as decorative backgrounds for action scenes. They feel massive and physical. You understand the geography of them. You feel their weight during combat. When cannons strike, the impact feels tangible instead of resembling digital debris floating across a screen. That practical texture helps the movie tremendously, because yes, there is a substantial amount of CGI throughout the film, but Gore Verbinski usually grounds it with physical detail, real sets, smoke, water, fire, ropes, shattered wood, practical movement. All those smaller elements stop the action from feeling artificial, and honestly, I had forgotten how much the movie values momentum. Characters are constantly escaping situations at the last possible second, stealing ships, crashing into ports, leaping between locations. The action rarely stays stationary for long, sometimes perhaps a little too long, if I am being fair. That is probably my one real criticism of parts of the action. Near the end, there are sequences where you can feel the runtime stretching slightly. The movie occasionally becomes so enthusiastic about its own spectacle that certain fights probably could have been shortened. But even then, I was rarely bored, because the action continuously changes shape. One moment it is a duel, then it becomes a naval chase, then a prison escape, then suddenly undead pirates are walking silently across the ocean floor toward battle. The film constantly introduces new variations to keep sequences from becoming repetitive, and I think the action works so well because the characters themselves fight differently too. Jack does not move like Will. Barbossa does not fight like Jack. The British soldiers feel distinct from the pirates. Even the chaos has structure underneath it. That attention to personality is what makes the action memorable. And interestingly, the movie also understands that action sequences can be funny without undermining the stakes. Jack Sparrow escaping danger often feels partially accidental. There are moments where it genuinely seems as though he survived purely because reality itself became confused and allowed him to leave. That unpredictability gives the action this wonderfully loose rhythm. You never fully know whether a scene is about to become exciting, absurd, or both simultaneously, usually both. I also love the atmosphere surrounding the nighttime battles. Moonlight reflecting across dark water, skeletal pirates transforming during combat, cannon smoke drifting through the frame. Visually, some of those sequences still look fantastic. Especially the final confrontation inside the treasure cave. That entire section feels like a pirate ghost story colliding directly into an adventure epic. And honestly, the movie deserves credit for not overcomplicating the action emotionally either. The objectives are always clear: rescue Elizabeth, escape the Navy, reclaim the Pearl, break the curse. Even when the broader plot becomes chaotic, the action remains easy to follow because the motivations underneath it are simple. That clarity matters far more than people sometimes realize. Spectacle without emotional direction becomes exhausting very quickly. Pirates mostly avoids that problem by tying the action directly to character motivations. Jack wants his ship back, Will wants Elizabeth safe, Barbossa wants the curse broken. Those desires drive almost every major confrontation in the movie, so even when everything becomes chaotic, it still feels connected. And honestly, the action simply feels like the filmmakers were having fun creating it. You can sense that enthusiasm in almost every sequence. The movie is not trying to reinvent action cinema or transform itself into some ultra-realistic combat experience. It just wants sword fights, pirate ships, explosions, curses, and adventure to look exciting for 2.5 hours. And to be fair, it absolutely succeeds. One thing I genuinely forgot before revisiting Pirates of the Caribbean. The Curse of the Black Pearl is how genuinely unsettling parts of it actually are. People mostly remember it as this huge entertaining pirate adventure, which it absolutely is, but the film also contains a surprisingly strong gothic horror atmosphere running beneath everything. And honestly, I think that darker edge is a massive reason the movie stands out instead of becoming just another generic action blockbuster. Because without the curse mythology, this is essentially a story about sword fights and pirate politics. The supernatural elements are what give the film its identity, and I love how gradually the movie introduces those elements too. At first, the Black Pearl feels more like folklore than an actual threat. You hear whispers about it. Fog drifting across the ocean, sudden nighttime attacks, characters describing pirates almost like ghost stories passed between sailors. The film builds atmosphere before fully revealing anything. Then eventually you arrive at that scene. Elizabeth standing surrounded by Barbossa's crew, while moonlight suddenly exposes what they truly are beneath the surface. Honestly, that moment still works incredibly well. The skeletal transformations could have looked unintentionally ridiculous so easily, especially considering early 2000s visual effects technology, but the sequence is staged carefully enough that it lands with genuine impact. And I think part of the reason it succeeds is because the movie refuses to rush the reveal. It lets the atmosphere develop first, the eerie cave, the shadows, the strange behavior from the pirates. Barbossa describing hunger, pain, and the inability to feel pleasure anymore. By the time the transformation happens, the audience is already uneasy. Then suddenly, the film shifts genres for a few minutes. It goes from swashbuckling adventure into full gothic ghost story almost instantly. And honestly, that tonal transition is a huge risk. Most movies struggle balancing comedy and horror because one element usually weakens the other. But Pirates somehow uses the horror elements to make the adventure more exciting instead of interrupting it. The undead pirates genuinely feel cursed, and that distinction matters. They are not simply monster antagonists inserted into the story to create action scenes. There is real sadness buried underneath the curse itself. Barbossa describes food turning to ash in his mouth, the inability to feel warmth, the impossibility of enjoying life anymore. These men are not immortal in some glamorous fantasy hero sense. They are trapped, exhausted, hollowed out by endless existence. And honestly, that makes the curse far darker than I remembered, especially for a Disney production. Visually, the horror imagery is still remarkably effective too. The skeleton pirates walking silently underwater remains one of the strongest images in the entire film. There is something genuinely haunting about it. No dramatic music forcing emotion onto the audience, no oversized action spectacle, just these undead figures moving quietly across the ocean floor toward their destination. It is the kind of visual that stays in your memory long after the movie ends. The moonlight transformations are also incredibly smart because the film uses restraint. The skeletal forms appear during carefully selected moments instead of constantly flooding the screen with visual effects. That limitation makes every transformation feel significant when it happens. And Gore Verbinski clearly already understood horror atmosphere because of The Ring. You can absolutely feel traces of that influence throughout parts of this movie. The fog drifting around the Black Pearl, the shadows, the moonlit caves. The quiet tension before attacks. There are scenes where the ship genuinely feels haunted instead of simply dangerous. Even the sound design contributes to that atmosphere. The creaking wood, chains rattling in darkness, cannons echoing in the distance. The way the undead crew move at times more like walking corpses than conventional blockbuster villains. There is real effort put into making them unsettling. And honestly, I think those horror elements were a huge part of why younger audiences connected with the film so strongly. The movie felt slightly dangerous, not fully safe in the polished family adventure sense audiences usually associated with Disney at the time. There are moments where the film genuinely brushes against nightmare imagery. Imagine seeing those skeletal transformations in theaters as a kid back in 2003. That probably stayed with people. But the movie never becomes overwhelmingly dark either, which is the balance it gets exactly right. It introduces horror atmosphere without making the entire experience oppressive or miserable. The unsettling moments make the pirate world feel stranger and larger without destroying the sense of fun underneath everything. That is an incredibly difficult balance to maintain. If the film leaned too heavily into horror, it would stop feeling adventurous. If it ignored the horror completely, the curse would lose its impact. Pirates somehow finds this perfect middle ground where the supernatural elements remain atmospheric, entertaining, unsettling, and occasionally even funny at the same time. And interestingly, the curse also makes Jack Sparrow more entertaining by contrast. While everyone else reacts to the supernatural elements with fear, desperation, or obsession, Jack often treats the horror like another irritating inconvenience interrupting his day. That contrast becomes genuinely hilarious in certain scenes. But honestly, I really do think the skeleton curse is one of the smartest creative decisions the movie made overall. It transformed what could have been a standard pirate adventure into something far more memorable, something with identity. Without the supernatural horror elements, Pirates of the Caribbean, The Curse of the Black Pearl probably still functions as an entertaining movie. With them, it becomes iconic. Rewatching the film now, I honestly expected portions of the CGI to look significantly worse than they actually do, because early 2000s visual effects can be unpredictable. Some films from that era still look impressive today, while others immediately resemble unfinished video game cinematics the moment modern high-definition formats expose them. But Pirates holds up surprisingly well. Not flawlessly, obviously. There are still a few moments where you can feel the age of certain shots, but overall, the effects remain effective because the movie uses them intelligently instead of drowning the entire production in non-stop digital spectacle. That is the crucial difference. The CGI exists to support atmosphere, not replace it, and honestly, the skeletal curse effects are still genuinely impressive even now, especially when you realize how technically complicated those sequences actually were behind the scenes. The filmmakers were not simply placing generic skeleton models over random actors. They had to preserve the performances underneath: movement, timing, facial structure, physical personality, or the illusion would completely fall apart, which is probably why the undead pirates still feel strangely physical. There is actual weight to them. You can tell Industrial Light and Magic invested serious effort into making the skeletal forms move like the actors themselves, rather than generic digital creatures. Barbossa still feels like Barbossa when transformed. The same goes for the rest of the crew. That continuity matters more than people sometimes realize, because visual effects usually fail when they stop feeling connected to real performances and physical environments. Pirates mostly avoids that problem remarkably well. I also appreciate how much practical texture the movie blends into everything: smoke drifting through scenes, firelight reflecting across wet surfaces, moonlight cutting through darkness, water crashing everywhere, real costumes, physical ship sets. All of those details help the CGI merge naturally into the world instead of standing apart from it. The movie never feels like actors standing in front of endless green screen environments. And honestly, Gore Verbinski apparently made life significantly harder for the visual effects artists in ways that ultimately improved the final film. Some of the battle sequences were shot with handheld camera movement during extremely complicated action scenes, which sounds almost unreasonable considering how much CGI had to be integrated afterward. That probably created enormous technical challenges for the effects teams, but visually it gives the movie energy. A lot of modern CGI-heavy blockbusters sometimes feel too clean, too controlled. Pirates has movement, instability, and texture. The camera shifts through smoke and shadows, explosions shake the frame, characters rush through chaos. The digital effects end up feeling more grounded because the movie itself is never standing perfectly still trying to showcase expensive imagery. And honestly, the moonlight concept was genius. The fact that the pirates only transform under specific lighting conditions automatically gives the film visual contrast. It allows scenes to alternate between practical pirate imagery and supernatural horror imagery naturally. It also prevents the movie from constantly overexposing the CGI, which probably helped the effects age more gracefully over time. Because again, the film understands restraint. There are many scenes where the Black Pearl's crew simply appear to be ordinary pirates. Then suddenly moonlight catches them from the right angle and the illusion disappears. Those moments still work because the audience is not overwhelmed with non-stop skeletal imagery every few minutes. I also think people underestimate how ambitious the ship work was for that era. The Black Pearl, the Dauntless, the Interceptor, these vessels feel enormous, heavy, physical. Even when CGI extends sections of the ships, the film grounds everything with practical construction, real materials, and physical locations whenever possible. And honestly, thank God for that, because filming around water already introduces enough chaos on its own. There is also something from this era of blockbuster filmmaking that I genuinely miss. The effects are not constantly demanding attention. Modern franchises sometimes feel desperate to impress audiences every single second visually. Pirates is more interested in atmosphere than technological exhibition. The visual effects serve mood first. That is why sequences like the underwater skeleton walk or the moonlit transformations remain memorable years later. Not because the film was aggressively announcing how expensive everything was, but because the imagery actually felt cinematic and eerie. And honestly, some of the most effective visual moments are not even the largest ones, like the wine pouring directly through Barbossa's skeletal ribs. That is such a simple, unsettling little visual, but it communicates the curse more effectively than pages of exposition ever could. Small details like that give the effects personality, and honestly, that is probably the best compliment I can give them, because the CGI in this film is not simply there to create spectacle. It actively helps define the identity of the movie itself. Without those supernatural visuals working properly, Pirates of the Caribbean, The Curse of the Black Pearl loses a massive part of what makes it memorable. Instead, the effects become part of the atmosphere, part of the mythology, part of the film's strange, distinctive charm. One thing The Curse of the Black Pearl absolutely gets right is the world itself. The moment the movie begins, you immediately feel pulled into this smoky, chaotic, weathered version of the Caribbean. And honestly, that atmosphere carries the film just as much as the characters do. Because imagine if this world looked artificial. Seriously, imagine if the ships felt lightweight, the costumes resembled costume shop replicas, and the environments had that overly polished theme park appearance. The illusion would collapse instantly, but the production design here is filled with texture. Mud, candlelight, damp wood, torn sails, drifting smoke, salt-stained surfaces, everything feels worn and lived in. That is probably the best way to describe the movie's visual identity. The world feels used. Even Port Royal has this fascinating contrast where the British-controlled spaces feel rigid, polished, and carefully ordered, while pirate territory feels unstable and unpredictable. You can almost sense the difference in atmosphere between locations before characters even speak. And honestly, the ships deserve their own recognition entirely. The Black Pearl especially still looks extraordinary, even now. The silhouette alone feels iconic. Dark sails moving through fog, lantern light flickering across the deck, cannon smoke surrounding the ship at night. The movie transforms the Pearl into something almost mythological before it even properly arrives on screen. It does not feel like transportation. It feels like a ghost story, and I love how physically large everything feels too. The ships have weight. You hear wood creaking beneath movement, ropes snapping in storms, cannons shaking entire decks during battle. The film understands that pirate ships should feel unstable and dangerous, not sleek and elegant. Even the smaller details help sell the world completely. The costume design is fantastic because it never feels overly theatrical, even though the movie itself absolutely embraces theatricality. Jack Sparrow's appearance alone communicates almost everything about him before he properly speaks. The beads, layered fabrics, weathered boots, rings, dirt, mismatched accessories. The outfit feels assembled over years of survival and improvisation rather than carefully designed for presentation. The same goes for Barbossa. Geoffrey Rush genuinely looks like someone who has spent decades at sea making terrible decisions and somehow enjoying most of them. Meanwhile, the British officers remain trapped inside rigid uniforms and powdered formality. The costume design quietly reinforces the central conflict between pirate freedom and structured authority without requiring dialogue to explain any of it. And honestly, Keira Knightley's costumes deserve recognition too, because the film actually integrates them into the story itself. The corset sequence early on is not simply visual decoration. It immediately establishes how restricted Elizabeth feels within her own environment. Then, as she moves deeper into pirate territory, her appearance gradually shifts alongside the adventure surrounding her. Small details like that matter enormously. I also forgot how genuinely strong the cinematography is throughout this movie. There are shots in Pirates that still feel cinematic rather than merely expensive. Moonlit skeletal reveals. Ships emerging silently through fog, torchlight reflecting across piles of cursed gold inside dark caves. The film constantly uses lighting to create atmosphere rather than simply illuminate scenes. That is something modern franchise filmmaking strangely struggles with sometimes. A lot of contemporary blockbusters are shot in this flat digital style where everything is technically visible, but almost nothing remains visually memorable afterward. Pirates actually look stylized: warm firelight, deep shadows, blue moonlight reflecting across dark water, bright tropical daylight during naval sequences. The film has visual personality. And honestly, I think Gore Verbinski deserves far more recognition for how immersive the entire experience feels. He films the environments like actual adventure spaces instead of decorative backgrounds. Characters are constantly climbing across ships, running through taverns, swinging between structures, navigating caves, moving through rooftops and harbors. The world feels physically connected. You always understand where people are. And that becomes incredibly important in a movie this chaotic, because the story itself already grows complicated enough. If the environments also became visually confusing, the entire experience would become exhausting very quickly. Instead, the production design keeps the audience grounded even while the plot spirals into curses, betrayals, mutinies, and undead pirates. I also love how carefully the film balances beauty with grime. There are genuinely gorgeous images throughout the movie, but nothing feels overly polished. Even the elegant British environment still contains smoke, shadows, crowded streets, damp stone, and dirt. The pirate locations especially feel rough and dangerous in exactly the right way. Tortuga, for example, feels loud, unstable, and exhausting. You believe people genuinely survived there. And honestly, that level of detail is a huge reason the movie aged as gracefully as it did. The world feels handcrafted rather than overwhelmingly digital. Even when CGI enters the frame, there is enough practical texture surrounding it that the illusion continues to hold together. You can tell real effort went into constructing this universe, instead of simply filling scenes with computer-generated spectacle. And I honestly think that is why audiences still enjoy revisiting this movie years later. The world itself feels inviting. Dangerous, cursed, chaotic, but inviting. You want to board the Black Pearl even though it would almost certainly end terribly for you. That is great production design. When the setting itself becomes part of the adventure. And honestly, I really do not think Gore Verbinski receives enough credit for why The Curse of the Black Pearl works as well as it does. People understandably focus on Johnny Depp, but directing a movie with this many moving pieces without it collapsing entirely is honestly kind of remarkable, because this film is juggling a huge amount simultaneously. Comedy, horror, action, romance, supernatural fantasy, pirate mythology, large-scale blockbuster spectacle, eccentric character humor, and somehow the movie never fully loses control of itself. Messy occasionally, absolutely. Overextended at times, definitely, but a complete disaster, never. And I think that comes down to Verbinski understanding the tone better than people sometimes realize. The smartest decision he makes is refusing to direct the movie with embarrassment. That sounds simple, but it matters enormously. He treats the pirate world seriously enough for the audience to invest emotionally in it, but he never allows the film to become stiff or self-important. There is always a slight mischievous energy running underneath the storytelling. The movie constantly feels like it is moving with a grin hidden somewhere beneath the surface. And honestly, I think Verbinski's earlier work helped prepare him for this in unexpected ways. Before Pirates, he had already moved between genres repeatedly. Mouse Hunt had exaggerated physical comedy. The Ring had atmosphere and psychological tension. And strangely enough, you can feel both influences blending together here, especially during the cursed pirate sequences. There are moments where the Curse of the Black Pearl briefly transforms into gothic horror, and Verbinski handles those tonal shifts remarkably smoothly. Fog rolling across the ocean, moonlight revealing skeletal figures. Long stretches of eerie silence before attacks. You can tell he genuinely enjoys building atmosphere instead of simply rushing from one explosion to another. And that is probably why the film still feels cinematic today, instead of simply resembling disposable content. Gore Verbinski allows scenes room to breathe occasionally. Not constantly, obviously, the movie moves with tremendous momentum, but there are these small pauses where the atmosphere is allowed to settle naturally. Ships emerging slowly through mist, characters quietly reacting to cursed gold. Jack Sparrow standing proudly on a sinking boat, pretending the situation remains completely under control. Those moments stay in your memory because the film does not rush past them immediately. I also think Verbinski understands physical movement exceptionally well. The action sequences in Pirates of the Caribbean, The Curse of the Black Pearl have flow to them. Characters are constantly climbing, swinging, improvising, crashing into obstacles, moving across spaces dynamically. The camera moves with the chaos instead of struggling against it. Even during complicated sequences, you almost always understand where people are and what is happening. That sounds like a basic filmmaking requirement, but modern blockbusters surprisingly fail at this all the time. Verbinski keeps the action readable without making it feel overly rigid. There is energy everywhere, but it remains controlled energy. The movie feels physically alive. Ships creak beneath pressure. Fire spreads unpredictably. Crowds panic. Sword fights move through environments instead of happening inside empty digital voids. Everything feels connected to a real physical world. And honestly, I think one of Verbinski's greatest strengths here is knowing when to simply let actors take control of scenes. Especially Johnny Depp and Jeffrey Rush. A weaker director probably would have tried to restrain those performances more aggressively. Verbinski mostly allows them to exist naturally inside the world. He trusts the eccentricity. And that trust is essential because Jack Sparrow only functions if the film allows him to remain unpredictable. You can easily imagine an alternate version of this movie, where the studio tried smoothing out all of Jack's strange qualities and turning him into a safer, more conventional action protagonist. That version probably becomes forgettable almost instantly. Verbinski leans into the chaos instead, and visually, the film has a genuine identity. That is another aspect I appreciate even more revisiting it now. So many modern franchise films eventually blur together visually, but Pirates has atmosphere, moonlight reflecting across water, firelight inside dark taverns, ocean fog swallowing ships whole, warm tropical color palettes colliding with gothic horror imagery. The movie genuinely looks adventurous, not excessively polished, not excessively digital, adventurous. Even the way Verbinski introduces the Black Pearl matters. He frames the ship almost like a horror creature emerging from mythology, slow reveals through fog, dark silhouettes moving through moonlight. The ship enters the story with the energy of a legend instead of simply the pirate vessel. Those kinds of directing decisions shape how audiences emotionally experience the movie. And honestly, I think Verbinski's willingness to embrace excess helped tremendously too. He does not approach this like a restrained modern blockbuster. He goes big, massive sets, elaborate naval battles, dramatic music, cursed skeleton crews, explosions, spectacle everywhere. Sometimes maybe too much spectacle, if we are being honest. There are definitely moments where the runtime stretches because Verbinski becomes carried away with another elaborate sequence or another action beat. The film probably could have lost 20 minutes and become tighter overall, but strangely enough, that excess also becomes part of the charm. The movie feels handmade in its chaos. Like a director genuinely excited to build an enormous pirate adventure rather than mechanically assembling franchise content scene by scene. And honestly, I think audiences connected with that enthusiasm immediately. Verbinski directs The Curse of the Black Pearl like someone who sincerely loves pirate mythology, not ironically, not cynically. He treats the movie like this giant playground where adventure, horror, comedy, and fantasy all collide together. That excitement leaks into every frame, and without that kind of direction, I genuinely do not think this movie becomes the cultural phenomenon it eventually did. I also do not think people fully realize how much the music in The Curse of the Black Pearl is contributing until they revisit the film years later. Because yes, everyone recognizes the theme instantly now. It is completely embedded into popular culture at this point. You hear those opening notes, and your brain immediately identifies Pirates of the Caribbean before you even consciously think about it. But rewatching the film again, I realized the score is doing far more than simply sounding epic. It is carrying enormous portions of the movie's energy. Honestly, there are scenes that would feel entirely different without that soundtrack pushing them forward. And what I love about the score is that it completely understands the kind of movie this is. It does not aim for subtle prestige drama emotion or restrained orchestral minimalism. The music wants adventure. It wants momentum. It wants dramatic entrances, ships emerging through fog, characters sprinting directly toward catastrophe with absolute confidence. It commits fully. And somehow the movie earns that level of musical intensity because the entire film itself is already operating at maximum pirate adventure energy most of the time. I also think the score quietly smooths over some of the movie's weaker spots too. There are moments where the plot becomes slightly chaotic or scenes continue longer than they probably should, but the music keeps the emotional momentum moving forward. It creates the feeling that the adventure never fully stops, and that matters enormously in a film this long. Because without the soundtrack constantly injecting energy into sequences, parts of the runtime probably would feel significantly heavier. Honestly, the music is also a huge reason the film feels larger in your memory than it actually is. You remember scenes as more epic because the score transforms nearly every major moment into a dramatic event. Jack Sparrow stepping onto a dock suddenly feels legendary. A ship turning direction feels heroic. Characters simply walking across a frame sometimes feels mythological because the soundtrack is escalating everything around them. And strangely enough, it works. It probably should not work as consistently as it does because the score is not subtle at all. But the movie understands that pirate adventures are supposed to feel oversized and romanticized. The music becomes part of the myth-making process itself. That is why the soundtrack remained iconic while so many blockbuster scores from that era slowly disappeared from memory. It has identity. You can hum the Pirates of the Caribbean music instantly. That is genuinely rare now. A lot of modern franchise music unfortunately feels interchangeable, but this score has this driving, adventurous rhythm that immediately embeds itself into your memory. And honestly, I think the film also uses silence more intelligently than people remember. Not every scene is overwhelmed by giant orchestral themes. Some of the supernatural moments actually pull the music back significantly. Quiet ocean ambience, creaking ships, eerie cave atmospheres, those restrained moments make the larger musical explosions feel even more powerful afterward. The soundtrack also somehow matches Jack Sparrow perfectly. There is this fascinating blend of recklessness and heroism running through the music that feels directly connected to his personality. The score sounds adventurous, but also slightly unstable. Almost like the soundtrack itself is improvising its way through danger the same way Jack does. And honestly, some of the action sequences would lose half their personality without that music driving them, especially the naval battles. Cannons firing, sails collapsing, swords clashing while the orchestra erupts behind everything. It gives the movie this grand old-school blockbuster energy that I genuinely miss sometimes. Adventure films used to allow adventure to sound adventurous. And yes, some people criticize the soundtrack for becoming repetitive across the later sequels, which honestly, that criticism is understandable. But in this first movie, the music still feels fresh. It had not yet become overused. There is still this excitement of discovery attached to it. You can almost feel the film realizing it has stumbled onto something iconic. And honestly, the soundtrack sells the emotional fantasy of the pirate world more effectively than almost anything else in the movie, because the film is not trying to portray piracy realistically. It is trying to make piracy feel legendary, dangerous, absolutely, but also exciting and romanticized in that grand storybook way. The music is essential to creating that atmosphere. Without it, Pirates of the Caribbean. The Curse of the Black Pearl probably still works as an entertaining adventure film. With it, though, the movie feels mythological, like an old sea legend being retold at full volume with complete sincerity. Now, as much as I genuinely love The Curse of the Black Pearl, I cannot honestly pretend the film is perfectly structured, because it absolutely is not. This movie is long, like surprisingly long when you revisit it now. In memory, it feels like this endlessly fast-moving pirate adventure, and to be fair, the energy remains high for most of the runtime. But then you look at the actual length and realize just how much story the film keeps trying to fit inside itself. And honestly, there are stretches where you can feel that weight, especially in the second half. The movie starts stacking twists on top of betrayals on top of shifting alliances, until eventually it almost feels like every character has secretly changed sides 3 separate times. Jack deceives someone, then maybe he did not, then Will gets captured, then a ship gets stolen, then another deal gets negotiated, then somebody escapes confinement again 5 minutes later. At a certain point, the film is surviving almost entirely on momentum, which, to be fair, is still pretty entertaining. But yes, structurally, the movie absolutely becomes messy at times. There are definitely scenes that could have been shorter. Some action sequences continue longer than necessary. Certain conversations repeat information the audience already understands, and the curse mythology occasionally starts sounding strangely complicated. There are moments where characters are explaining which gold pieces have been returned, whose blood matters, who can currently be harmed, who cannot, who betrayed whom decades earlier, and honestly, the film almost dares the audience to keep up with all of it. What is funny, though, is that the movie somehow remains consistently watchable, even when the plot starts wobbling. That is the strange magic of it. A cleaner version of this film almost certainly exists somewhere inside an editing room. You could probably remove 20 minutes and create a tighter, more efficient structure overall, but weirdly, I am not entirely convinced I would enjoy it as much. Because part of the charm of The Curse of the Black Pearl is how excessive it feels. The movie keeps throwing adventure at the audience nonstop. Another sword fight, another escape, another pirate speech, another betrayal, another naval battle. It almost feels like the film is terrified the audience might lose interest for even 30 seconds, so it constantly introduces another dramatic development. Sometimes maybe too aggressively, honestly. And yes, there are definitely logical gaps if you slow down and analyze the story too carefully. Certain character decisions clearly happen because the plot requires them to happen. Some coincidences are genuinely ridiculous. A few emotional moments pass quickly because the movie is already sprinting toward the next action sequence. But honestly, most audiences do not care while watching it, and that is the fascinating part. The film has enough personality that viewers forgive an enormous amount of structural messiness. Jack Sparrow alone distracts you from half the screenplay issues because every time the story starts becoming tangled, Johnny Depp walks into a scene doing something strange, and suddenly the movie becomes entertaining again. The tone helps tremendously too, because the film never behaves like some perfectly engineered historical epic. It feels more like someone enthusiastically telling you a pirate story while inventing parts of it halfway through the conversation. That loose storytelling energy becomes part of the experience instead of feeling like total failure. And honestly, some of the pacing problems became even more noticeable only after the sequels arrived. Because the later films pushed the franchise's weakest instincts much further: longer runtimes, denser mythology, more subplots, more betrayals layered on top of other betrayals. Looking back now, you can actually see the early signs of that excess beginning here already. The difference is that this first movie still feels fresh. It still feels excited by its own ideas. So even when scenes linger slightly too long, there is enough charm, atmosphere, humor, and momentum carrying everything forward that the film rarely becomes exhausting. At least not for me. Well, maybe during portions of the extended final act. Even then, though, the movie usually finds a way to recover before the momentum completely collapses. A clever line, a strong visual, a memorable action beat. A Jack Sparrow moment. Something always arrives at exactly the right time to pull the audience back into the experience. And honestly, I think that is why people continue rewatching this movie despite all its flaws. Because the entertainment value outweighs the structural imperfections. You are not watching The Curse of the Black Pearl for perfectly engineered narrative precision. You are watching it for cursed pirates, naval battles, skeletal sailors, supernatural adventure, chaotic energy, and Johnny Depp somehow surviving situations that realistically should eliminate him immediately. The movie understands that, and honestly, that self-awareness saves it. What makes The Curse of the Black Pearl even more impressive revisiting it now is realizing the kind of cinematic history it was walking into. Because pirate movies had a genuinely terrible reputation before this film arrived, and I do not simply mean that audiences were uninterested. Studios genuinely treated pirate films like financially cursed productions. Every time Hollywood attempted to revive the genre, something seemed to collapse along the way. The most famous example everyone still references is Cutthroat Island. That movie became legendary as a box office catastrophe, massive budget, difficult production history, commercial failure severe enough that it scared studios away from pirate films for years afterward. And honestly, once a genre develops that kind of reputation in Hollywood, studios become extremely cautious very quickly. So when Disney announced Pirates of the Caribbean, a lot of people reacted with immediate skepticism, which honestly made complete sense, because large-scale pirate movie inspired by a theme park ride genuinely sounds like a parody of a terrible studio decision when you say it out loud. And somehow this movie completely reversed the genre's reputation almost overnight. That is the remarkable part. Not only did The Curse of the Black Pearl succeed financially, it made pirate stories feel exciting again. Suddenly audiences wanted sea battles, cursed treasure, undead crews, dramatic pirate speeches, supernatural myths, and swashbuckling adventure again. The film essentially rebuilt the entire modern image of pirate cinema for a new generation. And honestly, I think part of the reason it succeeded where earlier pirate films struggled is because pirates never feels embarrassed by the genre itself. Some older failed pirate movies often felt trapped between trying to become serious historical dramas and trying to function as broad entertainment. This film simply embraces adventure completely. It understands that pirate stories are supposed to feel exaggerated, dangerous, theatrical, funny, and romanticized all at once. It stopped trying to fix pirate movies and instead just made one confidently. And interestingly, now that enough time has passed, the first film actually benefits from comparison with its own sequels too. Because I still enjoy parts of the later entries, and I know many people genuinely love Pirates of the Caribbean, Dead Man's Chest especially, but the franchise absolutely became heavier and more tangled as it expanded. More mythology, more side plots, more betrayals, longer runtimes, larger CGI spectacle. Eventually, the series almost disappeared beneath its own increasingly complicated pirate lore. And honestly, you can already see the earliest signs of that happening in the first movie. But here, it still feels controlled enough, or maybe controlled chaos is the better description. Because the Curse of the Black Pearl still remains relatively simple underneath everything. Jack wants the Black Pearl back. Barbossa wants the curse broken. Will wants Elizabeth safe. That emotional clarity helps hold the movie together even while the surrounding plot becomes chaotic. The sequels occasionally lost that simplicity, and I think another advantage the first film has, something the later installments struggle to fully recapture, is surprise. Nobody expected this movie to become what it eventually became. The eccentricity felt fresh. Jack Sparrow felt genuinely unpredictable. The supernatural elements felt exciting instead of overloaded with mythology and explanation. But once the franchise became enormously successful, there was naturally pressure to make every sequel larger than the last. Larger creatures, larger mythology, larger twists, larger spectacle. And eventually, the franchise started bending under the weight of its own scale a little, which honestly happens to a lot of blockbuster series. But the original film still has this freshness to it because it was not trying to maintain an empire yet. It was simply trying to work, and strangely enough, that gives the movie a lighter, more agile feeling compared to what followed afterward. I also think the first movie benefits enormously from not over-explaining everything. The later sequels dive much deeper into pirate politics, supernatural systems, mythological rules, and increasingly dense lore. The original keeps things remarkably straightforward by comparison. Cursed gold, undead pirates. Stolen ship, done. That simplicity actually helps the atmosphere feel more magical somehow. And honestly, even outside the Pirates franchise itself, you can absolutely feel how influential this movie became afterward. For years, studios kept trying to recreate this exact style of blockbuster adventure. Quirky antiheroes, mythological action, fantasy spectacle blended with comedy and supernatural atmosphere. Once you start noticing it, you can see traces of pirates everywhere, but very few films manage to capture the same balance, because a huge reason Pirates of the Caribbean, The Curse of the Black Pearl works is timing. It arrived right before blockbuster filmmaking became overly self-aware. The movie still feels slightly reckless, slightly messy, slightly accidental in the best possible way. Like lightning trapped in a bottle before anyone fully understood what they had created. And honestly, that is why I think audiences still return specifically to The Curse of the Black Pearl, even after all the sequels and franchise expansion. It is the installment that still feels creatively hungry, the one still discovering its own identity instead of protecting a billion-dollar brand. The film revived a genre studios had practically abandoned. It launched one of Disney's biggest modern franchises. It transformed Johnny Depp into a global blockbuster icon, and somehow it made pirate stories culturally relevant again. That is an almost absurd achievement for a movie many people originally assumed would fail immediately. And at the end of the day, I honestly think The Curse of the Black Pearl survives because it understands something a lot of blockbusters eventually forget. Audiences do not fall in love with perfection. They fall in love with personality, and this movie has personality everywhere. It is messy occasionally, definitely overlong in places. Certain plot mechanics become increasingly questionable the more carefully you analyze them. Portions of the final act drag slightly. Some visual effects have aged in a few isolated shots. And honestly, if you describe the movie out loud, it sounds completely ridiculous. Undead pirates cursed by Aztec gold. A pirate captain who walks like he is permanently dizzy. A Disney theme park adaptation, transforming into a gothic fantasy adventure with horror elements. None of this should work together as naturally as it does, but somehow the film simply clicks. And I think a huge reason audiences still revisit it is because it genuinely feels handcrafted. Not in the literal independent film sense, obviously. This production cost an enormous amount of money, but emotionally handcrafted. You can feel creative choices being made scene by scene, strange choices, risky choices, decisions that probably made studio executives deeply nervous at the time, especially Jack Sparrow. Because honestly, Jack Sparrow, becoming one of the defining blockbuster characters of the 2000s, still feels slightly unbelievable when you carefully revisit the performance. He is such an unusual protagonist for a major studio film. He is not cool in the traditional action hero sense. He looks sweaty, distracted, vaguely confused half the time. He survives through improvisation, manipulation, instinct, and sheer luck. He lies constantly. He stumbles through danger instead of dominating it, and audiences absolutely adored him. I think that happened because Jack never feels manufactured. He does not feel designed by committee. The character is too specific for that, too strange, too unpredictable. Watching him genuinely feels like Johnny Depp invented this bizarre pirate entirely inside his own imagination, and somehow convinced an entire blockbuster franchise to revolve around him. And honestly, the movie needed exactly that kind of energy. Without Jack Sparrow, The Curse of the Black Pearl probably becomes a solid pirate adventure people remember fondly every once in a while. With Jack Sparrow, it becomes iconic. That is the difference. You can literally feel the movie changing whenever he enters a scene. The rhythm loosens. Conversations become unstable in the best possible way. Action sequences become funnier, messier, and more entertaining. Even when the plot starts tangling itself into knots, Jack's presence keeps the movie alive because you genuinely never know what he is going to do next. And what is fascinating is that Jack also reshaped blockbuster characters afterward. You can see his influence everywhere now. The eccentric antihero joking through danger, surviving through improvisation, behaving slightly unstable while secretly being more intelligent than everyone else. Modern franchise cinema is filled with traces of Jack Sparrow, whether people consciously realize it or not. But the original still feels different because the eccentricity felt authentic here. It had not yet become a formula. And honestly, I think that is another reason this first movie still stands above most of the sequels. It still contains discovery. It still feels like a group of talented filmmakers unexpectedly stumbling into something special rather than carefully maintaining a massive entertainment machine. The film still has surprise, and that matters. Because when I revisit The Curse of the Black Pearl now, I honestly do not think about it primarily as the first Pirates movie anymore. I think about it as this strange moment where blockbuster filmmaking briefly became adventurous again. A huge studio production taking real creative risks with tone, atmosphere, character, humor, and visual style without fully knowing whether audiences would embrace any of it. And audiences absolutely did. The film revived pirate cinema, launched one of Disney's largest franchises, turned Jack Sparrow into a global pop culture figure, completely changed Johnny Depp's career trajectory, created one of the most recognizable blockbuster soundtracks ever made, and somehow made Cursed Skeleton Pirates feel legendary again. That is a genuinely remarkable legacy. And the funniest part is that after all these years, after every sequel, every imitation, every expansion of the franchise, the image most people still remember is usually the simplest one in the entire movie. Jack Sparrow arriving heroically on a ship that is actively sinking beneath him. That single moment tells you everything. The chaos, the charm, the confidence, the absurdity. That is the curse of the Black Pearl in one perfect image.